The lamp is turned low so the light pools yellow across the desk and does not reach the corners of the room. Outside, Scotland is dark and wet, the way it is dark and wet for most of the year, and somewhere below the window, a dog shifts in its sleep on the stone of the landing. The house is called Skibo. It is enormous, and at this hour it is silent. On the desk lies a stack of paper, handwritten, the ink slightly uneven where a tired hand pressed too hard on some words and too lightly on others. Beside it sits a second stack, smaller, written in a different hand altogether, rounder, steadier, unhurried. This second hand has been crossing out sentences, adding others, moving a paragraph from the bottom of one page to the top of another, so that a memory that happened in April now reads as though it happened in June, because June sits better beside the sentence that follows it. The woman at the desk is not the man whose name will appear on the cover. She never intended to be. She is simply the one still awake. There is a particular quiet that settles over a house once its most famous resident has gone to bed, and its papers are left in the hands of someone who loved him enough to finish what he could not. It is not a sad quiet. It is closer to devotion, the kind of quiet that hums faintly, like a kettle that has been taken off the heat but has not yet stopped remembering the boil. You do not need to know her name yet. You only need to know that this happened more than once, in more than one house, in more than one country. Across the years, historians would later gather under a single gilded label. Wives, widows, daughters, sitting up long after the story's subject had gone quiet, deciding page by page which version of a man's life the world would be allowed to keep. The Gilded Age liked to believe it kept no secrets. Newspapers covered every ball, every yacht, every engagement, every scandal, with an appetite that seems almost frantic when you look back at it now. Column after column of small type devoted to who wore what, who danced with whom, whose fortune had grown and whose had quietly begun to shrink. It was an era that performed its own history in real time, for an audience that could not get enough of watching the very rich behave. And yet, underneath all that noise, something quieter was happening. It was happening in studies and libraries and drawing rooms, at desks positioned near windows for the light, in the hours after a household had gone to sleep. It was happening in the private correspondence between a widow and a publisher's editor. It was happening in the careful, patient work of rewriting. Because for all their visibility, the men whose names defined this era, the railroad men, the steel men, the men who built fortunes from iron and oil and coal and never quite learned how to hold a pen the way they held a boardroom, rarely wrote their own final word. When it came time to set down the story of a life, to decide what the public would remember and what it would never know, it was very often a woman who did the actual work. Not the man whose portrait hung above the fireplace, the woman who had spent 30 years watching him from somewhere just out of frame. This was not always deception, not in the way that word usually gets used. Sometimes it was simple practicality, a husband too old, too tired, too newly dead to finish what he had started, and a wife who had listened to the stories so many times she could recite them in his cadence. Sometimes it was closer to rescue, a life full of scandal and misstep, and a woman determined that history would remember the version of him worth remembering. And sometimes, if you look closely enough at the letters and the drafts and the things that were quietly left out, it was something else again. Something closer to authorship. Something closer to power exercised in the only room where these women were allowed to hold it completely. The room where the story got written down. Tonight is about that room. Not the ballrooms, not the yachts, not the newspaper columns everyone else has already told you about. Tonight is about the desks, the ink. The pages moved from June to April and back again. The wives and widows of the Gilded Age who took their husbands' unfinished lives and quietly, patiently, without ever once raising their voices, decided how those lives would be remembered. Let yourself sink into it slowly. There is no need to follow every date, every name. Let the details drift past the way lamplight drifts across old paper, softly and then softer still. You are not here to memorize anything. You are only here to listen, until listening turns into something gentler, and the rest happens on its own. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Begin with a simple fact, one that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. Andrew Carnegie, steel magnate, library builder, the man whose name is carved into more stone facades than almost any other American industrialist, did not finish his own autobiography. He began it. He dictated fragments of it, in the manner of a man used to dictating memoranda to clerks who wrote quickly and asked no questions. But the book that eventually reached the public in 1920, a year after his death, was not simply his. It passed first through the hands of his wife, Louise, and only afterward through the hands of an editor named John Van Dyke, a family friend entrusted with what he himself called, with quiet formality, a labour of love. You can picture the process if you try. Carnegie, in the last years before the war swallowed his optimism whole, sitting at Skibo Castle in the long Scottish summers, recalling his boyhood in Dunfermline, his early poverty, the bobbin factory, the telegraph office, the friendships that turned into fortunes. He liked to talk. Those who knew him said he liked almost nothing better than an audience for his own story, and for years that audience had been Louise, 21 years his junior, patient in the particular way that only someone who has heard a story many times can be patient, waiting through the repetitions for the details that shifted slightly with each telling. When he began to set the memories down on paper, it was Louise who kept the pages in order. It was Louise who noticed when a story he told in June contradicted a story he'd told in April, and who quietly decided, without asking him to relitigate the discrepancy, which version would survive into the manuscript. It was Louise who understood, better than he did by that point, which memories flattered him and which ones did not, and who nudged the balance gently toward the former without ever seeming to nudge at all. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it is easy to imagine editing as something cold, a red pen, a crossed-out sentence, a note in the margin. But the editing that happened in rooms like the one at Skibo was warmer than that, and stranger. It was the editing of love, which is to say it was never neutral. Louise was not trying to produce an accurate document. She was trying to produce a husband worth remembering, using a version of him that was true enough to be believable and flattering enough to be bearable, in the specific proportions that only a wife of 30 years could calculate. The war came, as it always seems to in these stories, and interrupted everything. Carnegie had spent decades preaching that industrial progress would eventually make war obsolete, that men who did business together would have no appetite left for killing each other, and the summer of 1914 undid that belief so completely that those who were near him said something in him simply stopped. He lost, as his wife would later write, his health and his ambition together, as though the two had always been the same organ. The memoir breaks off, mid-sentence in spirit if not in fact, somewhere in the years before the guns started. He never picked it up again with any seriousness. He died in August of 1919, the manuscript still unfinished, still just a stack of paper on a desk in a quiet house. It would have been easy at that point for the project to die with him. Plenty of memoirs did, begun in optimism, abandoned in illness, left to moulder in a drawer until some distant descendant found them and wondered whether to bother. But Louise did not let that happen. She gathered what existed. She brought in Van Dyke, whose job, by his own careful description, was to do as little as possible, to arrange what was there chronologically, to let the seams show as little as he could manage, to preserve the sound of Carnegie's own voice even in the places where that voice had gone quiet forever. And she wrote the preface herself, a short document that does something quite remarkable if you read it closely. It does not claim to have written the book. It claims only to have made sure the book existed at all. That distinction mattered to her, and it is worth understanding why. A wife who claims authorship risks accusations of vanity, of overreach, of having put words into a great man's mouth for her own benefit. A wife who claims only stewardship, who describes herself as the keeper of a flame rather than its source, risks nothing at all. She becomes, in the public imagination, simply devoted. And devotion, unlike authorship, was a quality Gilded Age society had no trouble allowing a woman to possess in unlimited quantity. So the book was published under Andrew Carnegie's name, exactly as it should have been, because the memories inside it were his, the poverty, the ambition, the specific shape of his rise from immigrant boy to the richest man in the world. But the architecture around those memories, the order in which they appeared, the moments that were softened and the moments that were sharpened, the very fact that the book existed as a finished object rather than a box of loose pages, that belonged in no small part to Louise. History remembers the name on the spine. It rarely asks who decided where the chapters would break. This is the pattern you will hear again and again tonight, in different houses, under different names, with different fortunes at stake. A man builds something enormous, a railroad, a steel mill, a shipping line, a social position that took a lifetime to construct, and in the process of building it, he loses the time or the inclination or sometimes simply the years he would have needed to write it all down properly. And a woman nearby, closer to him than anyone else alive, quietly does the work instead. Not always with his knowledge, not always with his full blessing, but almost always with a kind of care that the men themselves, busy with boardrooms and ledgers, had long since stopped extending to their own biographies. There is something almost tender in imagining Louise at that desk after Carnegie's death, arranging his memories the way you might arrange flowers cut from a garden that no longer belongs to anyone, trying to capture in whatever container was available something that had already begun gently to wilt. She was not rewriting his life so much as she was preserving it, the way pressing a flower preserves its shape long after its colour has faded. The book that resulted is not perfectly accurate. Few memoirs are. But it is, in its way, an act of devotion so complete that it becomes difficult, 100 years later, to separate the man's voice from the woman who made sure that voice could still be heard. Consider too what this meant for Louise personally, in the months after her husband's death. She was 62 years old. She had spent more than 3 decades as the wife of one of the most famous men alive, present at his side through the building of libraries and the breaking of strikes, through his triumphs and the quieter, less publicised doubts that visited him in the years when his fortune had grown larger than any use he could think to put it to. And now she was a widow, with a stack of unfinished paper and a choice to make. She could have let the manuscript remain unfinished, a private grief, tucked away, never subjected to public scrutiny. Instead, she chose to finish it in public, to let strangers read her husband's boyhood alongside her own careful stitching, knowing that some of those readers would eventually notice the seams. It is worth pausing here, in this quiet hour of the night, to consider how much courage that decision required, and how little credit it has ever received. We remember Andrew Carnegie's name on library facades across 2 continents. We remember The Gospel of Wealth, the essay in which he argued that a man who dies rich dies disgraced, that fortunes must be given away during a lifetime rather than hoarded for heirs. We do not, as a rule, remember that his final and perhaps most personal work reached us only because his widow refused to let it stay unfinished. History has a way of collapsing collaboration into a single name. It happened to Louise Carnegie. It would happen, in the chapters ahead, to women whose stories are stranger still. There is a smaller detail in the story that rarely makes it into the official accounts, and it is worth including here precisely because it is small. In the years before his death, Carnegie had developed a habit of testing his memories aloud before committing them to paper, the way a man might hum a tune before deciding whether it was worth writing down. He would tell Louise a story at breakfast. He would tell it again, slightly differently, at dinner a week later. He would tell it a 3rd time to a guest, embellished now, the way stories tend to grow when they meet a fresh audience. Louise kept no formal record of these tellings, but she remembered them in the particular way that a spouse remembers the shape of a story better than its teller does, because she had heard it from the outside every time, while he had only ever heard it from within. By the time the manuscript reached Van Dyck's desk, then, it was already the product of years of quiet selection. Not falsification, but the ordinary editorial instinct of someone who has heard a story so many times she knows which version rings truest and which version simply sounds best. This is not so different from what any biographer does. The difference is that Louise had no formal claim to the title. She was not hired. She was not credited on the title page beyond a modest preface. She did the work because the work needed doing, and because she was, in that particular household, the only person left who could do it. It is tempting from this distance to imagine Louise as some kind of covert operator, quietly seizing narrative control while her husband's back was turned. The truth is gentler than that, and perhaps more interesting. She was not seizing anything. She was simply present at the one moment in the process when presence mattered most, after the subject of the biography could no longer speak for himself, and before the public had decided what to think. In that narrow window, whoever holds the pen holds something close to the last word. Louise held the pen. She held it carefully, and she held it for him, but she held it. Think too about what the finished book chose to include and what it chose to leave in soft focus. The chapters on the Homestead Strike of 1892, one of the more difficult episodes of Carnegie's business career, in which striking steelworkers at his Pennsylvania plant faced armed guards, while Carnegie himself remained overseas in Scotland, are present in the memoir, but they read differently than the newspaper accounts of the time. The tone is regretful rather than defensive, reflective rather than justifying, the voice of a man looking back with the soft sorrow of hindsight rather than the hard calculation of a man protecting his reputation in real time. Whether that tone reflects how Carnegie actually felt in his final years, or how his widow believed he ought to be remembered as having felt, is a question the book itself does not answer, and perhaps cannot. This is the quiet power available to anyone entrusted with finishing another person's unfinished work. It is not the power to invent, it is the power to select, to decide which of several true things gets to stand nearest the light, and which true things are allowed to recede a little further into shadow. Louise Carnegie exercised that power with restraint by most accounts, and with what appears to have been genuine devotion to the man whose voice she was preserving. But restraint and devotion do not make the power disappear, they only make it harder to see. The book was received warmly when it finally appeared. Reviewers praised its candour, its warmth, its evident sincerity, precisely the qualities Louise and Van Dyke had worked so carefully to preserve. Few in the initial wave of coverage dwelled very long on the fact that the man being praised for his candour had been dead for a year, and that the sentences carrying his voice into bookshops across 2 continents had passed through the hands and judgment of a woman whose name appeared only in a modest preface near the front. That was, in its way, precisely the outcome Louise had worked toward. Not recognition, preservation. The distinction, to her, seems to have mattered a great deal. For now, let the image settle, a lamp burning low in a Scottish castle, a stack of handwritten pages, a woman who understood her husband's voice so completely that she could finish his sentences on paper as easily as she once finished them at dinner. The house around her is dark and enormous and quiet. Somewhere outside, rain moves gently against old stone, and at the desk, patiently, without any need for credit, the real work of remembering continues. Move now from Scotland to Newport, Rhode Island, where the cottages, a word the very rich used with a straight face to describe 60-room mansions facing the Atlantic, stood shoulder to shoulder along a cliff walk built for viewing the ocean without ever having to touch it. Somewhere among those cottages in a rented house called Arley lived a woman named Elizabeth Drexel, later Elizabeth Drexel Lehr, later still Lady Decies, a woman who would eventually write one of the most quietly devastating memoirs to survive the era, though she gave it her husband's name and called it simply King Lehr and the Gilded Age. Elizabeth was, by the time she married Harry Lehr in 1901, already a widow with a young son, a woman of considerable fortune in her own right, drawn into a marriage that society understood far better than she did at the time. Harry Lehr was, in the language of the era, a wit, a man invited everywhere for his ability to entertain, to arrange a dinner party seating with surgical precision, to make Mrs. Astor herself laugh at exactly the moment laughter was needed. He was, by every social measure available to a Gilded Age hostess, an ideal companion. He was also, as Elizabeth would only fully understand after the wedding night, not interested in her in the way a husband is conventionally expected to be interested in a wife. It would be many decades before American society had any comfortable language for what Harry Lehr was. Elizabeth herself, writing in the 1930s, does not name it directly. She circles it instead, the way memoirs of that era so often circled the things they could not say outright, describing a husband who filled her days with wit, and her nights with a loneliness she had no vocabulary to explain even to herself. Modern readers, coming to the book decades later, tend to read between those careful lines with little difficulty. Harry Lehr was almost certainly gay, in a period and a social class where such a thing could never be spoken, only lived around, quietly, at enormous personal cost to everyone involved. This is the frame around everything else the book does, and it matters, because it changes the nature of the work Elizabeth was performing when she sat down, years after Harry's death in 1929, to write his story. She was not simply preserving a husband's memory the way Louise Carnegie had preserved Andrew's. She was managing a far more delicate operation, constructing a version of her marriage and of her husband that could exist in public without ever collapsing under the weight of a truth she could not print. King Lehr and the Gilded Age is, on its surface, an affectionate, gossip-rich account of high society at its most extravagant. Parties with monkeys as guests of honour, dinners built entirely around a single joke, a world so absurdly indulgent it reads at times like satire. Underneath that surface, though, it is something else. It is a widow's careful, decades-long negotiation with a secret she carried alone for the length of her marriage, and chose, in the end, not to bury, but to transform. Consider what it must have taken to write that book. Consider sitting at a desk, page after page, reconstructing decades of dinner parties and society feuds, and Mrs. Astor's particular brand of imperiousness, all while carrying, silently, the knowledge of exactly why your own marriage had felt so hollow at its centre. Elizabeth had every reason to simply let Harry Lehr's memory fade, to move on, as she eventually did, into a second marriage to Lord Deasy's, and let the first marriage recede quietly into the past the way so many difficult marriages of that era were permitted to do. Instead, she chose to write. She chose to be the one who decided what history would know about a man who in life had decided so much about what she was allowed to know. There is a kind of justice in that reversal, even if it is a quiet one, even if it never announces itself as justice on the page. For the length of their marriage, Harry Lehr held nearly all the narrative power in the relationship. He was the wit, the personality, the reason the Lehr name appeared in the society columns at all. Elizabeth was, for most of those years, simply Mrs. Lehr, a supporting character in her own household. But he died first, as husbands in these stories so often do, and in dying he handed her, without meaning to, the one thing he had always controlled, the story. She took it, she shaped it, she published it under his name in the title, generous to the last, but every sentence inside belonged entirely to her. The book is frank in places that startled reviewers when it appeared. It describes the vast, exhausting emptiness of a socialite's life with unusual honesty, the sense, which Elizabeth conveys again and again, that the women of this world filled their days with parties precisely because they had been given nothing else to fill them with. No careers, no formal education beyond etiquette and languages, no place in society beyond the roles their husbands and fathers permitted them. She writes about her fellow society wives with real tenderness, but also with a kind of grief that seeps through even the most glittering passages, a sense that all of them, herself included, had spent their best years performing a life rather than living one. And she writes about Harry with something that is difficult to name precisely. Not quite love, not quite resentment, but a complicated tenderness shaped by decades of proximity to a man she never fully possessed and never fully understood, and who, in his own way, never fully understood himself either, trapped as he was in a period that offered him no honest way to exist. Reading the book today, knowing what Elizabeth could not print, you can feel her working around the edges of a truth too dangerous for the page, choosing instead to let readers glimpse it only in the negative space between what she says and what she carefully declines to say. This too is a form of authorship, perhaps the most demanding form of all. It is easier, in some ways, to write a flattering falsehood than to write an honest account with one crucial fact removed, and to do it so carefully that the removal itself becomes a kind of statement. Elizabeth Drexel Lehr managed that balance for the length of an entire book. She protected her husband's public reputation, protected her own dignity, and still managed to leave a record clear enough that historians, decades later, would be able to read between the lines and understand a great deal of what she never explicitly wrote. It is worth remembering, too, what the alternative would have looked like. A different widow in a different mood could have used a memoir like this one for revenge, could have aimed every page at exposing a husband who had, by any modern reading, deceived her about the fundamental terms of their marriage. Elizabeth chose otherwise. Whether that choice came from genuine affection, from social self-preservation, from simple exhaustion with the whole subject, or from some combination of all three is impossible to know for certain. But the choice itself, made and sustained across hundreds of pages, is its own kind of history writing. She decided deliberately what kind of book this would be, and having decided, she wrote it exactly that way, with a discipline that few writers, professional or otherwise, ever managed to sustain. The title alone rewards a second look. King Lehr and the Gilded Age, not Elizabeth and Harry, not My Marriage, not even, simply, Harry Lehr. King Lehr, the nickname society had given him, the persona he performed so well that even his own wife sometimes seemed to address the performance rather than the man beneath it. By naming the book after that persona, rather than after Harry Lehr the private individual, Elizabeth performed one final act of careful curation. She let the myth stand at the front of the book, in the largest type, exactly where society had always wanted him, bright, witty, unassailable, while she, the author, the one who actually knew what lay beneath the performance, remained, as she so often had in life, just slightly out of frame. Somewhere in a rented drawing room, years after both marriages had ended and both husbands had died, an old woman sat with a stack of paper not unlike the one in Scotland, working through decades of memory with the same patient, careful hand. She was not trying to expose anyone. She was trying, in her own complicated way, to finish a story that had never quite been allowed to finish itself, while both of its subjects were still alive to argue over the ending. When she was done, she sent it to a publisher, and the world received a glittering account of Gilded Age excess that concealed, in its careful silences, one of the era's most private griefs. It helps, in imagining Elizabeth at that desk, to remember what her days had actually looked like during the marriage itself. Newport summers meant a calendar filled almost hour by hour. Morning calls, afternoon drives along the cliff walk, dinners that could run to a dozen courses, evenings that ended in ballrooms lit by candles no one ever seemed to worry about the cost of. Harry orchestrated much of it. He had a genius, everyone agreed, for the small mechanics of a successful party. Who should sit beside whom, which rivalry could be diffused with a well-placed joke, which guest needed flattering, and which needed occasionally a gentle public deflation to keep the whole ecosystem of Newport society in balance. Elizabeth watched him work these rooms for years, admiring the skill even as she absorbed slowly and privately the cost of being married to a performance rather than a person. There is a particular loneliness in that kind of marriage that the book captures without ever naming it outright. The loneliness of being surrounded every single evening by more company than any one person could reasonably want, while still going to bed each night beside someone who remained, in the ways that mattered most to her, a stranger. Elizabeth describes the parties in loving, granular detail. The menus, the music, the particular shade of a particular gown worn to a particular ball 20 years earlier, remembered with the vividness of someone who has turned an unhappy period over in her mind so many times that even its smallest details have become polished smooth. That vividness is itself a kind of evidence. People do not usually remember unhappy years in such loving detail unless something in them is still, quietly, trying to make sense of what happened. It is worth noting, too, how carefully the book handles the other society wives of the period, many of whom were still alive and reading when it was published. Mrs. Astor appears as imperious but never cruel. Rivals appear as worthy opponents rather than villains. Even the women who had, by Elizabeth's own private account elsewhere, treated her coldly during the hardest years of her marriage, are rendered with a generosity that reads almost as strategic, as though Elizabeth understood that a memoir too sharp-tongued about the living would draw exactly the kind of scrutiny that might, in turn, draw attention to the one subject she needed scrutiny to avoid entirely. Kindness, in this book, functions as camouflage as much as it functions as genuine feeling. Both things can be true of the same sentence. By the time Elizabeth finished the manuscript, she had outlived not only Harry, but much of the world he had ruled so completely from the centre of every Newport ballroom. The Gilded Age itself was gone by the 1930s, replaced by a leaner, more anxious decade in which stories of monkeys seated as dinner guests read less like reportage and more like fable. That distance may have made the writing easier. It is simpler to be generous to a vanished world than to a living rival. It is simpler, too, to protect a secret once its keeper is the only person left who fully understands what is being protected, and why. Not every woman in this story confined herself to rewriting a husband's memory. Some wrote their own, and in doing so, rewrote the story of the men around them almost as a side effect, the way turning on a single lamp in a dark house inevitably illuminates the furniture standing nearest it. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan belongs to this second category, and her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, remains one of the most quietly radical documents to emerge from the entire Gilded Age, precisely because of how calmly it dismantles the fairy tale everyone else had already agreed to believe. Consuelo was the daughter of William Vanderbilt and the formidable Alva Vanderbilt, heir to one of the largest railroad fortunes in America, and in 1895, at the age of 18, she was married to the 9th Duke of Marlborough, in a ceremony so heavily covered by the press that the New York Times assigned 6 separate reporters to it, one of them tasked with nothing but describing the bridesmaids' gowns. It was, by every external measure, the social triumph of the decade. American money meeting British aristocracy, a transaction so cleanly symbolic of the era's ambitions that it barely needed commentary. Except that Consuelo herself had not wanted the marriage. She had been in love with someone else. Her mother, Alva, determined that a duke's coronet was worth more than her daughter's preference in the matter, is said to have kept Consuelo virtually confined in the months before the wedding to prevent an elopement. None of that reached the newspapers at the time. The public got the fairy tale, the American heiress, the ancient title, the wedding of the century, and for decades that was the only version available. It was not until 1952, when Consuelo was 75 years old and the Duke long since divorced from her and dead besides, that she sat down and wrote the version she had actually lived. The book became an immediate sensation, topping bestseller lists for 20 weeks, and it caused precisely the uproar you would expect from a family that had spent half a century curating a much gentler story. Members of the Vanderbilt clan were reportedly furious. One newspaper columnist at the time observed with evident relish that for a woman of Consuelo's regal bearing to publish such an intimate accounting of her own unhappiness was nothing short of a shock to everyone who thought they already knew her. What makes The Glitter and the Gold such an unusual document in this larger story is the direction its revision runs. Louise Carnegie and Elizabeth Drexel Lehr had each, in their own ways, worked to protect her husband's reputation, softening, omitting, arranging memory into its most flattering shape. Consuelo did something closer to the opposite. She used her own memoir to correct a story that had, for 50 years, flattered everyone except her. The Duke of Marlborough, in her account, is not the romantic prize the newspapers had made him out to be, but a man who had married her for her fortune with an almost businesslike lack of pretense, informing her frankly, not long into the marriage, that he had made a great sacrifice in choosing her over another woman he had genuinely loved. Alva, her own mother, fares little better in these pages, remembered as a force of will so total that resistance had never felt like a real option. There is something almost startling about the calm with which Consuelo delivers these revelations, decades removed from the events themselves. She does not write with the heat of someone still nursing a fresh wound. She writes with the settled clarity of someone who has had half a century to turn the story over in her mind, and has finally decided in old age that the record deserved to be set straight before she was no longer able to set it. That patience is its own kind of power. A younger Consuelo, writing in the immediate aftermath of her unhappy marriage, might have produced something angrier, more defensive, more easily dismissed by contemporaries as bitterness. The elderly Consuelo, writing from the safe distance of old age and a second, apparently happier marriage to Jacques Balsan, produced instead something that read as testimony rather than complaint, measured, specific, and for that very reason, far harder for her family to simply wave away. It is worth pausing on the timing, because timing in every story tonight turns out to matter almost as much as content. Consuelo waited until both her mother and her first husband were dead, before publishing the fuller account of her early life. This was not cowardice. It was, if anything, a kind of discipline, an understanding perhaps learned across decades of observing how these things worked, that a memoir published while its subject still lived would become a battle rather than a record. Wait long enough, and the people who might have contested your version of events are no longer in a position to contest anything. The story becomes, by simple attrition, yours alone to tell. This pattern recurs throughout the Gilded Age's afterlife in print. Widows waited, daughters waited. The women who eventually wrote the truer, harder versions of their own lives tended to do so only once the men who had shaped those lives, husbands, fathers, the occasional domineering mother, were safely beyond the reach of rebuttal. It gives these late-life memoirs a peculiar quality, somewhere between confession and verdict, written in the unhurried tone of someone who has finally been given the last word after decades of being denied it. Consuelo's book did more than correct her own record. It quietly altered how an entire generation would come to understand the practice of transatlantic marriage between American fortunes and European titles, a practice that had been reported throughout the 1880s and 1890s almost entirely as a triumphant exchange of money for status, with barely a thought spared for what the young women at the centre of these exchanges actually experienced. After The Glitter and the Gold, it became much harder to read those old wedding announcements without wondering what they had left out. One woman's careful, decades-delayed honesty had reshaped, in some small but permanent way, how history would read dozens of similar marriages she had never even met the participants of. There is a lesson in that ripple effect, though the book itself never states it directly. A memoir does not only revise the story of the person who writes it, it revises, by implication, every similar story that came before, inviting readers to wonder what other officially happy Gilded Age marriages might have concealed a version closer to Consuelo's than to the fairy tale the newspapers preferred. In this way, the quiet work of one woman correcting her own record became something larger, a kind of retroactive permission for an entire era to be looked at more honestly than it had ever agreed to look at itself while it was still happening. Picture her then, in the years before the book's publication, an old woman by then, living in France with her second husband, the marriages and scandals of her youth reduced to distant memory for most of the world, but still, evidently, vivid enough in her own mind to fill hundreds of pages with specific, unhurried detail. She'd spent her entire young adulthood as a character in someone else's story. Her mother's ambitions, her first husband's financial rescue, the press's endless fascination with dollar princesses marrying into the British peerage. In old age, at last, she became the author instead of the subject. It is a small, quiet kind of triumph, arriving so many decades after the events it describes that almost no one left alive could argue with it. It helps, too, to remember what Consuelo's daily life had actually looked like inside the marriage she would later describe so plainly. Blenheim Palace, the Marlborough family seat, was a house so large that Consuelo herself once admitted she rarely knew, on any given afternoon, which of its hundreds of rooms her husband might be occupying. The building was cold in a way that seeped past mere temperature. Drafty corridors, distant staff, a household run according to centuries of ritual that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with maintaining appearances for a lineage far older than anything her own family's fortune could purchase. She arrived as an 18-year-old girl who had been told, essentially, that her personal happiness was a reasonable price for a title, and she spent years learning to live inside that arrangement with the outward composure the role required. The book does not dwell in bitterness when it describes these years, and that restraint is worth noticing, because restraint of this kind takes far more discipline than its opposite. Consuelo writes about the Duke's coldness the way you might describe weather, a fact of the climate she lived in, something to be endured and occasionally admired for its severity, rather than something to rage against on the page. This tonal choice does something important. It makes the account feel less like an act of revenge and more like an act of simple, patient documentation, which is precisely why it landed with such force when it finally reached readers. A furious memoir can be dismissed as score-settling. A calm one is much harder to argue with. There is also something quietly instructive in how the book treats her own mother, Alva. By the time Consuelo wrote The Glitter and the Gold, Alva had gone on to become one of the most prominent suffragists in America, a formidable public advocate for women's independence who nonetheless had, decades earlier, forced her own daughter into a loveless marriage without a second thought for that same independence. Consuelo does not flatten this contradiction into simple hypocrisy. She lets it sit, uncomfortable and unresolved, exactly as it must have felt to live inside it, a mother who fought fiercely for women's rights in the abstract, while denying her own daughter the most basic right to choose her own life. That refusal to simplify, to let a complicated woman remain complicated on the page rather than collapsing her into villain or hero, is itself a mark of the same patient authorial control every woman in this story seems to have arrived at independently, as though the circumstances themselves taught the skill. By the time the book reached shelves, the England Consuelo had married into no longer quite existed either. Blenheim had survived 2 world wars by then, its vast rooms repurposed, its household staff a fraction of what it had been in 1895. The aristocratic world that had once made her marriage feel like such an enormous transaction had been quietly, permanently diminished by decades of taxation and social change. Reading her account against that backdrop, it becomes something more than one woman's personal history. It becomes an elegy for an entire system of exchange. American money, European titles, young women treated as the currency that made the whole arrangement possible, written by one of the very few people who had lived inside that system long enough and survived it well enough to describe it plainly once it was finally, safely, over. Let the image rest there a moment. An elderly woman at a writing desk in the south of France, decades removed from a wedding 6 New York Times reporters once considered too important to cover with anything less than an entire team, finally setting down the story exactly as she remembered living it, with no one left to tell her she remembered it wrong. It is worth asking, in the quiet middle of the night, how so many Gilded Age women came to possess the particular skills this work required. The patience for revision, the instinct for which detail flatters and which detail wounds, the discipline to sit with a stack of paper for months at a time until a life resolved itself into a readable shape. The answer has less to do with any formal literary training, which most of these women never received, and more to do with an education so thorough it rarely announced itself as education at all. It simply looked, to everyone living through it, like the ordinary business of being a wife. Consider what a Gilded Age daughter of means actually learned in the years before her debut. Not history in any rigorous sense, and rarely mathematics or science beyond a polite acquaintance. What she learned instead was observation, the ability to read a room in a single glance, to notice who had been seated too near a rival, whose gown had clearly cost more than her husband's business could presently support, which guest's silence meant boredom and which meant calculation. She learned correspondence, hours of it, letters written and received and carefully filed, a lifelong apprenticeship in choosing exactly the right words for exactly the right audience, knowing that a poorly phrased note could end a friendship as surely as a poorly aimed insult. She learned, too, the management of a household so large it functioned essentially as a small business, staff to be hired and dismissed, budgets to be tracked even when the family fortune made such tracking seem unnecessary, schedules to be maintained across multiple properties in multiple cities, sometimes multiple countries. This kind of management required exactly the same skills a biographer needs, the ability to hold an enormous quantity of detail in mind at once, to notice what belongs together and what does not, to impose order on material that would otherwise remain simply a pile of facts. None of this was ever described at the time as training for authorship. It was described as the proper education of a lady, a phrase that carried with it a certain condescension even from the people who used it approvingly. And yet look at what it produced. Louise Carnegie's decades of listening to her husband's stories, filing them mentally by tone and by truth, were not so different from the note-taking a professional biographer performs. Elizabeth Drexel Lehr's years of managing a Newport household, tracking the shifting alliances of an entire social season, gave her precisely the narrative instincts she would later use to manage the far more delicate task of protecting her husband's secret. Consuelo Vanderbilt's early training in the strict formal correspondence expected of an aristocratic household gave her decades later the exact tone of measured restraint that made the glitter and the gold so effective. The men of this era, by contrast, were educated for entirely different purposes, and it shows in their own writing. Andrew Carnegie's early notes and memoranda, the raw material his wife would later shape into something readable, are full of business logic and moral pronouncement, but comparatively thin on the kind of narrative shading that makes a life feel lived rather than merely reported. This was not a failure of intelligence. It was simply a difference in training. A man like Carnegie had spent his adult life issuing instructions and evaluating outcomes. He had rarely, if ever, been required to sit with another person's feelings long enough to render them convincingly on paper. His wife had been doing precisely that in one form or another for the whole of her adult life. There is an irony worth sitting with here in the particular quiet of this hour. The Gilded Age, for all its enormous male fortunes and enormous male reputations, was in many ways a female literary economy operating just beneath the surface of the male one. Women writing the letters that preserved family history, women keeping the diaries later historians would depend on, women managing the correspondence that keeps any large family functioning across distance and time. Almost none of it was published under a woman's own name while she was alive to see the credit. Nearly all of it, when it finally surfaced decades later in archives and estate sales, turned out to be essential to understanding the men whose names had absorbed all the public attention. This was not, in most cases, a conspiracy or even a fully conscious strategy. It was simply how the available roles distributed themselves. Men built the fortunes and gave the speeches and signed the contracts that made the newspapers. Women held the memory, and memory, it turns out, is the raw material every biography is eventually made from. The men who dictated their recollections in old age were drawing, whether they realized it or not, on decades of prior conversation with wives who had already, quietly, begun shaping those recollections into something coherent long before any editor or publisher entered the picture. It is tempting to romanticize this arrangement, and equally tempting to resent it, and the honest truth probably sits somewhere between those two responses. These women were not, for the most part, frustrated novelists denied a fair chance at their own careers, though a few certainly were. Most seemed to have understood the work they were doing as an extension of the marriage itself, a final act of care performed for a husband who could no longer perform it for himself, whether because he had died or grown too old, or simply never possessed the patience the task required. But understanding the work as care does not make it any less skilled or any less consequential. A century later, we are still reading the results of that care, often without knowing whose hand actually shaped the sentences we take, without thinking twice, to be a great man's own voice. Think for a moment about how differently we might read the entire Gilded Age if these women's names appeared where they belonged. Not in a modest preface, not absent entirely, but on the spine, beside the men whose lives they had spent decades learning to see clearly enough to write down. The books themselves would not need to change a single word. Only the credit would shift. And yet that shift, small as it sounds, would completely rearrange how an entire era gets remembered, not as a collection of great men who happened, conveniently, to leave behind eloquent records of their own greatness, but as a collaboration, largely uncredited, between men who lived remarkable lives and women who had spent their entire education learning exactly how to make those lives legible to everyone else. It is worth walking through what a single ordinary day of this education actually looked like, because the phrase proper education of a lady tends to flatten into an abstraction unless you picture the specific hours it filled. A girl of 12 or 13, in a household of real means, might spend her morning at needlework, not for the finished object, which mattered little, but for the discipline of sustained, careful attention to a small task performed correctly over many hours. She might spend an hour at the piano, not because anyone expected her to perform professionally, but because music, like needlework, taught patience with repetition, the willingness to attempt the same passage a dozen times until it finally sounded the way it was supposed to sound. She would practice her penmanship separately from her lessons, because a lady's hand needed to be immediately recognizable and consistently legible across hundreds of letters written over a lifetime, and she would copy passages of approved literature by hand again and again, absorbing rhythm and cadence the way a musician absorbs scales, until good sentences began to feel as natural under her pen as bad ones would have felt foreign. In the afternoon she might sit with her mother while calls were received. An hour or two of formal visiting, conversation calibrated with exquisite precision to the relative social standing of each guest, every exchange a small performance of memory and tact. Who had married whom the previous season, whose daughter had disappointed her family, and in exactly what manner it was permissible to allude to that disappointment, without stating it outright. Whose fortune had grown, and whose had begun quietly to falter, and how one was expected to behave toward each in turn. This was not idle gossip, though it wore gossip's clothing. It was a curriculum in narrative construction, a girl learning, session after session, how a life gets summarized for public consumption, which facts stay in the summary, and which facts are permitted to disappear entirely. By the time such a girl reached marriageable age, she had spent a decade or more in an apprenticeship that never called itself an apprenticeship, training in exactly the skills a later widowhood or late-life memoir would require. She had memorized how families told their own stories, generation after generation, at the dinner table and in the drawing room, refining which anecdotes got repeated and which quietly fell away. She had learned, without ever once being told this was the lesson, that a story survives not by being complete, but by being told consistently. The same shape offered again and again until the shape itself becomes indistinguishable from the truth. When Louise Carnegie sat down decades later with her husband's unfinished pages, she was not improvising a new skill. She was applying, to a formal manuscript, exactly the editorial instinct she had been quietly developing since childhood at her own mother's afternoon calls. There is a particular kind of tragedy folded into this observation, though the word tragedy risks overstating what these women themselves, for the most part, seem to have experienced as simply the shape of their lives rather than a wound. A skill this refined, developed across an entire childhood and honed across decades of adult practice, was never once officially named as a skill, never credentialed, never rewarded with a byline while its possessor was young enough to enjoy the recognition. It surfaced only at the end, in a widow's preface, in a memoir published safely after every rival was dead, in the careful selection of which pages of a husband's unfinished manuscript deserved to survive. A lifetime of training, and its only acknowledged output arriving in the final chapter of that same life, almost as an afterthought. And yet perhaps afterthought is the wrong word too. Perhaps it is more accurate to say that this was always the plan, if plan is even the right term for something so quietly assumed by an entire social class that it never needed to be spoken aloud. A woman's education prepared her, first and always, to be useful to a household and a husband across the whole of a marriage. That the same preparation made her uniquely equipped to control the story of that marriage once it ended was simply a fact her world had never bothered to notice, because it had never occurred to anyone in that world that noticing was necessary. The skill hid in plain sight for the same reason so many of the women who possessed it hid in plain sight, because a society that trained them so thoroughly to be unremarkable succeeded, for a long while, in making even their most remarkable work look unremarkable too. Let this settle for a moment before the story moves on. Somewhere in every one of these households, long before any pen touched any final page, a girl was being taught to notice everything and say nothing about most of it. An education that looked, to the world watching, like nothing more than good manners, and turned out decades later to be the exact set of skills required to quietly rewrite history. Behind every one of these quiet, private acts of authorship stood a more public and more business-like machinery, and it is worth spending some time inside that machinery now, because it explains how a widow's private editing became, eventually, a printed book sold in shops across 2 continents. Publishing houses in the early 20th century understood perfectly well what they were buying when a famous name's memoir arrived on an editor's desk. They were not buying a flawless historical document. They were buying a story readers already wanted to believe, polished into a form smooth enough to sell. Houghton Mifflin, the house that eventually published Andrew Carnegie's autobiography, had built its reputation on precisely this kind of careful, respectful handling of important reputations. When Louise Carnegie brought them her husband's unfinished manuscript, the negotiation that followed was not primarily about accuracy. It was about tone, about pacing, about which of the available anecdotes would carry a reader most pleasantly from the poverty of Dunfermline to the philanthropy of the library building years, without dwelling too long on the uncomfortable middle chapters, where a fortune of that size had actually been assembled. John Van Dyke, the editor eventually chosen for the task, was selected in part because he was a family friend rather than a professional biographer with an outsider's appetite for uncomfortable questions. The choice of editor was itself an editorial decision, made before a single sentence of the manuscript had even been reviewed. This is worth understanding clearly, because it complicates any simple story of a wife secretly seizing control from an unwitting publishing industry. The industry was, in most cases, an eager collaborator in exactly the kind of legacy management these women were performing. A publisher wanted a bestseller, and a bestseller required a subject readers could admire without reservation. A widow wanted her husband remembered well. These 2 goals aligned so neatly that the editorial process rarely required any explicit negotiation over what to include or exclude. Everyone in the room already agreed, tacitly, on the general shape the finished book needed to take. The work was simply a matter of filling that shape in with true or true enough material. Consider how differently this process might have unfolded if the industry itself had valued unflinching accuracy over readability and reputation. A publisher determined to print Andrew Carnegie's full, unvarnished record. The Homestead strike handled with the same directness a modern investigative account might apply. The labour politics rendered without the softening hindsight that crept into the eventual text would have produced a very different book, and quite possibly a less successful one. Readers in 1920, mourning a man many of them associated primarily with the libraries dotting their own hometowns, wanted the Carnegie of the libraries, not the Carnegie of the Pinkerton agents. The publisher understood this, the widow understood this, and so the finished manuscript reflects in nearly every choice a shared understanding of what the market actually wanted, dressed up in the language of honouring a great man's memory. The financial dimension of all this deserves its own honest accounting, because these were not, in most cases, charitable projects undertaken purely out of devotion. A best-selling memoir generated substantial royalties that in several of these stories flowed directly to the widow who had done the uncredited work of assembling the finished text. Louise Carnegie did not need the money in any practical sense. Her husband's fortune had already secured her comfortably for the remainder of her life. But for other women in similar positions, a husband's memoir represented a genuine and sometimes crucial source of income during widowhood, particularly in cases where an estate had been more heavily encumbered by debt or legal complication than the family's public reputation ever suggested. This financial reality reframes the whole practice in a slightly less sentimental light, and it is worth sitting with that reframing rather than rushing past it. A widow assembling her husband's memoir was not always, or only, performing an act of pure devotion. She was also, quite reasonably, managing an asset, one of the few assets a woman of that era could control outright, since so much of a family's actual wealth typically passed through trusts and estates managed by male executors and attorneys who answered to no one but the terms of the will itself. A finished manuscript, by contrast, was hers to negotiate, hers to revise, hers to sell to the highest bidder among competing publishing houses if she chose to shop it around. In a financial landscape that otherwise offered widows remarkably little direct control, the book itself became, for some of them, one of the only levers they could pull without anyone's permission. It is worth imagining, too, the actual mechanics of these negotiations, which tended to happen through a small circle of trusted intermediaries rather than through any direct correspondence between a grieving widow and a publishing house's business office. A family lawyer might handle the contract terms, a friend within the literary world, someone like Van Dyck, might handle the delicate work of shaping content, while shielding the widow herself from the more commercial, less dignified aspects of the negotiation. This arrangement preserved at every step the appearance that the widow was engaged purely in an act of loving remembrance, even as the underlying transaction moved forward with all the calculation of any other publishing deal. Appearance and reality did not need to match. They simply needed to coexist without ever being placed too plainly side by side in public. There were inevitably disagreements along the way, a publisher pushing for more scandal than a widow was willing to permit, or a widow pushing for more sentiment than a publisher believed the market would bear. These negotiations rarely survive in any detailed written record, because neither party had much incentive to document a disagreement that might later embarrass either the family name or the publishing house's reputation for tact. What survives instead are the finished books themselves, smooth and confident on the page, revealing almost nothing of the quiet friction that must have preceded their final shape. Historians who have gone looking for early drafts where they exist at all sometimes find entire episodes present in an early manuscript and absent from the published version. A scandal softened here, a business rival's name quietly removed there, a paragraph of genuine anger replaced in the final printing with something closer to wistful regret. None of this should diminish what these women accomplished, even as it complicates the sentimental version of the story. Managing a manuscript through this kind of negotiation required exactly the same skills as managing a Gilded Age household or a Newport social calendar: patience, tact, an instinct for which battles were worth fighting and which concessions cost nothing to make. The widows who succeeded at producing a finished published memoir were not passive vessels through which a dead husband's voice simply passed unaltered into print. They were active participants in a genuinely difficult negotiation, conducted largely behind closed doors, in which they had to satisfy a grieving family's need for dignity, a publishing house's need for profitability, and their own private sense of what the truth actually deserved to look like on the page. By the time any of these books reached a bookstore shelf, then, they had already passed through several distinct layers of careful shaping. The widow's own editorial instinct, the trusted intermediary's diplomatic softening, the publisher's commercial judgment about what readers actually wanted. The name on the cover remained in every case the husband's alone, but the object itself, the specific arrangement of words a reader would eventually hold in their hands, was the product of an entire quiet economy of women's labour that the title page never once acknowledged. It is worth picturing the physical objects involved in this process, because the tactile reality of early 20th century publishing shaped the work in ways that can be easy to forget from the distance of a century later. A manuscript in this era was not a digital file that could be revised with the touch of a key. It was hundreds of typed or handwritten pages, mailed between parties across an ocean when Scotland and New York were involved, each revision requiring a fresh round of correspondence, each correction a physical act of retyping or careful insertion. A widow assembling her husband's memoir was not simply making editorial decisions in the abstract. She was managing an enormous, unwieldy physical object, tracking which version of which chapter had last been sent where, coordinating a production process that could easily take a year or more from first draft to finished, bound book sitting in a shop window. This slowness had its own quiet advantages. It gave a widow time to sit with a difficult passage for weeks before deciding whether it deserved to survive, time to consult with trusted friends about how a particular episode might land with readers, time to simply live with her own grief long enough that the editorial decision she eventually made felt considered rather than reactive. Modern readers, accustomed to instant revision and instant publication, sometimes underestimate how much the deliberate pace of early 20th century book production shaped the finished character of these memoirs. A book assembled over 18 unhurried months carries a different quality of judgment than one assembled in a rushed 6 weeks, and nearly every memoir in this story belongs firmly to the former category. There is also the question of what happened to the material that did not survive this long, slow winnowing process. Publishing houses of the era rarely preserved rejected drafts with any particular care. Paper was not treated as a precious historical artifact in the moment of its own creation, only later once archivists and historians began combing through what family estates happened to have kept. This means that for every memoir we can read today, there likely existed an earlier, rawer version, closer to the actual unfiltered voice of its subject, that no longer exists in any recoverable form. The widow's editorial hand is visible to us now only in the gap between what we know from other sources actually happened and what the finished book chose to say about it. The discarded pages themselves, in most cases, are simply gone, burned in a fireplace or lost to decades of estate clearances, taking with them whatever rawer, less flattering version of events they might once have contained. This should give us some humility about how completely we can ever reconstruct the original negotiation between a widow's memory and a publisher's commercial instincts. We are reading, in nearly every case, only the smoothed final surface, the version that survived every round of revision precisely because it satisfied everyone involved. The rougher drafts, the arguments over a single contested paragraph, the moment a lawyer suggested a particular scandal be handled more delicately than the widow herself might have preferred. All of this exists now mostly in inference, in the small inconsistencies and suspiciously convenient omissions that careful readers can sometimes detect if they compare a published memoir against the messier record left behind in newspapers and private correspondence from the same period. Let this settle into the night's slower rhythm now. Somewhere behind every gilded name on every spine in this story, an entire unseen negotiation had already taken place. A lawyer's letter, a trusted friend's careful edit, a widow's patient insistence on one detail and quiet surrender of another, all of it invisible in the finished book, all of it essential to its existence. Every archive tells two stories at once, the story of what was kept and the quieter, harder to trace story of what was destroyed. Historians who spend enough time in the private papers of Gilded Age families learn to notice the second story, mostly through its absence. A gap in an otherwise complete run of correspondence, a diary that stops abruptly for 18 months and then resumes, as though nothing had happened. A folder in an archive's finding aid labelled simply, without explanation, missing. Fire was the most common method, and it is worth imagining the actual scene rather than treating it as an abstraction. A widow, in the weeks or months after her husband's death, sitting before a fireplace with a box of letters on her lap, deciding one at a time which pages deserved to survive into whatever version of the family history she intended to preserve. This was not usually a dramatic scene. It rarely involved a single decisive bonfire consuming years of correspondence in one cathartic evening. It was slower than that, more deliberate. An evening here, an afternoon there, across many months, the fire in the grate serving its ordinary domestic purpose, while also, quietly, performing a second function nobody in the room would have described aloud as editing. What tended to go into the fire? Letters that documented business practices a family preferred not to have preserved in a rival's eventual biography, correspondence with women who were not the wife holding the letters, evidence of affairs or entanglements that a widow had no wish to have her children discover after her own death. Whenever that eventually came, occasionally financial records that revealed a fortune built on foundations less solid or less honest than the public reputation suggested, and sometimes, simply, letters that were too painful to keep, not scandalous in any legal sense, just raw in a way a widow no longer wished to encounter every time she opened a particular drawer. It would be easy to treat this destruction as a kind of theft committed against future historians, and in a narrow sense it was exactly that. Every burned letter is a permanently closed door, a version of events that can now never be checked against first-hand evidence. But it is worth holding two truths at once here, the way the best historians eventually learn to. The destruction was also, from the widow's own perspective, an act of protection. Protection of her husband's memory, protection of her children from discoveries that could only wound them, protection of her own dignity in a world that offered widows very little privacy to begin with. She was not required to preserve every uncomfortable fact for the benefit of readers who would not exist for another 100 years. She was living her own life, in her own present moment, making decisions about what she could bear to have survived her. Elizabeth Drexel Lehr's papers offer a particularly instructive case, precisely because of what we know she chose not to burn. She kept enough of her Newport correspondence intact that later historians, working from newspaper accounts and the surviving letters of mutual acquaintances, have been able to reconstruct a great deal of the social world King Lehr and the Gilded Age describes. What she appears to have destroyed, or perhaps simply never committed to paper in the first place, is the more intimate record of her actual marriage. The letters, if any existed, that might have documented Harry Lehr's private life more explicitly than her careful published memoir ever allowed itself to do. The gap is telling precisely because it sits exactly where you would expect the most sensitive material to have been. This selective preservation is, in its own way, a final act of authorship, arguably the most powerful one available to any of these women. A published memoir can be fact-checked, at least in part, against surviving newspaper coverage and the correspondence of other people present at the same events. A destroyed letter cannot be checked against anything. It simply does not exist to contradict whatever version of events the widow chose to leave standing. In this sense, the fireplace functioned as the final and most absolute editorial tool available to a Gilded Age widow, more powerful than any negotiation with a publisher, more permanent than any carefully worded preface, because it did not merely shape the historical record. It eliminated entire portions of the raw material any future historian might have used to challenge that shaping. There is a reason so many family archives, when they finally open to researchers decades or even a century later, contain suspiciously tidy collections, years of correspondence that happen to document exactly the version of events the family's authorized histories already described, with barely a stray letter to complicate the picture. Archivists who work regularly with Gilded Age estates have learned to read these tidy collections with a particular kind of suspicion, not because tidiness itself is evidence of wrongdoing, but because real lives, lived by real people over many decades, rarely produce paper trails this clean without some deliberate intervention along the way. It is worth considering too what this practice meant for the women who performed it, beyond its effect on the historical record. Sitting before a fire with a box of a dead husband's most private correspondence is an intimate, often painful act of confrontation. A widow doing this work was not simply protecting an abstract reputation. She was reading, perhaps for the first time in full, evidence of parts of her husband's life she had never been permitted to witness directly. His private business dealings, his correspondence with friends and rivals, occasionally his correspondence with other women. The decision about what to burn and what to keep required her to sit, alone, with information that might have reshaped her own understanding of the marriage she had spent decades inside. That she then made a considered choice about what the rest of the world would be permitted to know says something remarkable about the discipline these women brought to grief itself, treating even their own private devastation as material to be managed, curated, and, where necessary, quietly consigned to the flames. None of this is offered as an argument that the destruction was either fully justified or fully regrettable. It was simply what happened, in house after house, across the whole of this era, and it shapes, invisibly, permanently, every account historians have since been able to construct. We know the Gilded Age largely through what its widows decided we were allowed to know. The letters that might have complicated or contradicted that picture went, in an unknowable but certainly substantial number of cases, into the fire, along with whatever inconvenient truths they might have carried forward into a century their authors would never live to see. Consider, too, the practical logistics of a household large enough to generate the sheer volume of paper these families accumulated. A prominent Gilded Age household might receive dozens of letters a week, business correspondence and social invitations and family news arriving by every post, all of it requiring some system of filing, retention, or disposal simply to keep the household functioning. Most of this ordinary paper was discarded as a matter of course, the way any busy household today discards junk mail without a second thought. The letters that survived into a formal archive were, almost by definition, letters someone had made a deliberate choice to keep, which means that even the surviving record before any widow ever approached it with editorial intent had already been shaped by decades of ordinary domestic triage. The bonfire of widowhood was simply the final and most consequential round of a filtering process that had been happening quietly since the earliest days of the marriage. This matters because it complicates the tidy image of a single dramatic burning, a widow deciding in one determined evening what history would and would not know. In practice, the shaping of the record was cumulative, distributed across decades of small decisions made by multiple people. A husband who never bothered to keep his more embarrassing correspondence in the first place, a household secretary trained to discard routine business letters after their immediate usefulness had passed, a widow performing one final pass over what remained. By the time any given collection reached a modern archive, it had already survived a gauntlet of quiet editorial choices stretching back to the earliest years of the marriage, most of them made by people who never thought of themselves as editors at all. Some families, it should be said, took the opposite approach entirely, preserving everything with an almost obsessive completeness, boxes upon boxes of routine correspondence kept intact for reasons that had less to do with historical foresight than with simple habit or sentiment, or the sheer inertia of a large household where no one had ever been assigned the task of throwing anything away. These over-preserved archives present their own peculiar challenge to researchers, not because anything has been hidden, but because the sheer volume threatens to bury the significant letters beneath thousands of routine ones, invitations to dinners long forgotten, receipts for goods no one remembers purchasing, notes about servants' wages and household repairs that tell you a great deal about the mechanics of Gilded Age domestic life, and comparatively little about the emotional truth of any particular marriage. In these cases, the widow's editorial hand is visible not in what was destroyed, but in what was allowed to remain undifferentiated from the noise, hidden less by fire than by sheer accumulation. There is a particular kind of humility this should instill in anyone trying to reconstruct these lives from the surviving paper trail, and it is worth naming plainly here in the story's quieter middle hour. We are not reading history as it happened. We are reading history as it survived a century of deliberate and accidental filtering, performed by dozens of hands, only the last and most consequential of which belonged to the widow with the fireplace. Every biography built from these archives, including the one you're listening to now, inherits that filtering whether it acknowledges the inheritance or not. The honest response is not to distrust every surviving document, but simply to hold it a little more loosely than certainty usually allows, to remember that what remains was always, in some sense, chosen to remain, by people with their own reasons, most of which we will never fully recover. There is a question worth asking about every memoir in this story, one that rarely appears in the reviews written at the time but matters enormously to anyone trying to understand how these books actually functioned as instruments of history-making. Why this year and not another? Why did Louise Carnegie push to see her husband's autobiography into print within a single year of his death, while Consuelo Vanderbilt Belson waited decades, publishing only once she was an old woman herself, safely beyond the reach of every person who might have contested her account. The timing of these books was never accidental. It was, in nearly every case, its own deliberate act of authorship, arguably as consequential as anything written on the actual pages. Consider what publishing quickly accomplishes. A memoir that appears within a year of a prominent man's death arrives while public grief and public affection are still at their peak, while newspapers are still inclined toward warm retrospectives rather than harder-edged reassessment, while rival accounts have not yet had time to accumulate and complicate the record. Louise Carnegie's swift publication of her husband's autobiography benefited enormously from this timing. The book arrived into a cultural moment primed to receive it warmly, and the warm reception it received helped cement, for decades afterward, the version of Andrew Carnegie the book presented: generous, reflective, a self-made man who had used his fortune wisely. A slower publication, arriving after the initial wave of mourning had faded, and the harder questions about homestead and labour practices had time to resurface with fresh force, might have met a considerably less forgiving audience. Now consider the opposite strategy, the one Consuelo chose. Waiting decades meant that nearly everyone who might have disputed her version of her own marriage, her first husband, her formidable mother, most of the society figures who had witnessed the marriage firsthand and was no longer alive to offer a rebuttal. It also meant that by the time the book appeared, the entire social world it described had already vanished, transformed by 2 world wars and the general decline of the old aristocratic order into something closer to historical curiosity than living controversy. Readers approached the glitter and the gold not as a scandal about people they might encounter at next season's parties, but as a fascinating glimpse into an era already safely closed. That distance protected Consuelo from exactly the kind of immediate social consequence that might have followed a younger, more urgent version of the same book. These 2 strategies, the rush to print while affection runs warm, and the patient wait until every rival witness has died, represent in a sense the 2 available tools any widow or aging heiress possessed for controlling how her story would land. Neither is inherently more honest than the other. Both are, in their own ways, calculated responses to the same underlying problem. How does a woman with limited formal power over her own historical record exercise the power she does have, in a manner most likely to produce the outcome she actually wants? There were, inevitably, women who miscalculated this timing, and their stories offer a useful corrective to any temptation to view every widow in this narrative as a flawless strategist. Memoirs rushed to print too quickly sometimes arrived before a family had fully agreed on the version of events it wished to present, leading to public disputes between siblings or in-laws that undid much of the intended flattery. Memoirs delayed too long sometimes lost their moment entirely, appearing so many decades after the events they described that readers had simply moved on, more interested in newer scandals than in relitigating a marriage from an era most of them barely remembered. The timing had to be judged with real precision, and the women who judged it well deserve credit for a skill that resembles, in its essentials, the same instinct a skilled political strategist brings to the release of a difficult story. Not concealment exactly, but careful management of exactly when and how the truth arrives. It is worth noting too how external events beyond any widow's control could reshape this calculus entirely. The First World War interrupted Andrew Carnegie's own work on his memoir, and by extension delayed its eventual publication, but the war's aftermath also created a cultural hunger for stories about a gentler, more optimistic era before the fighting had begun, a hunger the eventual 1920 publication of his autobiography was able to satisfy almost perfectly, arriving into a moment when readers were eager for exactly the kind of nostalgic, self-made man narrative the book provided. Louise Carnegie could not have planned for the specific cultural mood of 1920 when she first began assembling her husband's pages years earlier, but the timing worked in the book's favour regardless, a reminder that even the most carefully managed publication timeline still depended, in the end, on forces no single widow could fully control. This uncertainty adds a layer of genuine skill to the whole enterprise. A widow managing the timeline of her husband's memoir was not simply picking a date from a calendar. She was making a continuous series of judgments, revised as circumstances shifted, about when public appetite and private readiness might finally align. She had to read the newspapers, gauge the mood of her own social circle, weigh her own emotional capacity to withstand public scrutiny against the practical benefits of publishing sooner rather than later. This was, in every meaningful sense, a form of strategic communication planning conducted decades before that phrase existed, performed by women who had never once been formally trained in anything resembling public relations, relying instead on the same instinctive social reading their entire upbringing had quietly prepared them to perform. There is something worth admiring in the particular quiet of this hour, in how completely these women understood that a story is never simply told. It is always told at a particular moment, to a particular audience, in a particular cultural climate that shapes how every sentence will land regardless of the sentence's own content. They understood this instinctively, long before anyone had given the insight a name, and they used that understanding, patiently and without fanfare, to shape not just what history would say about their husbands, but exactly when history would be permitted to hear it. It is worth spending a little more time with the mechanics of how a widow actually gauged this readiness, because the process was neither purely intuitive nor purely calculated, but some patient blend of both. She would have watched, in the months following a husband's death, how the newspapers covered his passing, which obituaries dwelled on his philanthropy, and which lingered on his business controversies, which competitors offered gracious tributes, and which offered only cool, formal acknowledgement. She would have listened, at the social calls and dinners that continued even through mourning, to how acquaintances spoke of him when they believed themselves to be speaking freely, gathering a rough private sense of how public opinion was actually settling, distinct from whatever the newspapers had officially decided to print. All of this informal research, conducted without a single formal survey or focus group, gave her a working understanding of the emotional terrain any eventual book would need to navigate. There was also the matter of family consensus, which could complicate even the most carefully planned timeline. Children, siblings, in-laws and trustees often held their own opinions about when and whether a memoir should appear, and a widow determined to publish quickly sometimes found herself negotiating not only with a publisher, but with her own extended family, several of whom might have preferred a more cautious, delayed approach, or no publication at all. These negotiations rarely appear in any surviving record, conducted as they were in private conversation rather than formal correspondence, but their outcome shaped every published memoir just as surely as the publisher's editorial notes did. A widow who wanted her husband's story told quickly had to be prepared to hold her ground against relatives who preferred silence, and the fact that so many of these books did eventually appear, often against some quiet internal family resistance, speaks to a determination that rarely receives the credit it deserves. Think finally about what it must have felt like to live inside that waiting period yourself, whichever strategy you had chosen. For the widow who rushed to publish, there was the particular pressure of working through fresh grief while also managing a publisher's deadlines, drafting decisions that would calcify into permanent public record before she herself had fully processed the loss they described. For the widow who waited decades, there was instead the long, slow discipline of carrying a story privately for the length of an entire additional lifetime, revising it quietly in her own mind year after year, waiting for a moment that might never actually arrive if her own health failed first. Both paths required a kind of endurance that the finished, polished memoirs rarely hint at on the page. The books read as though they emerged easily, inevitably, in exactly the form the world eventually received them. The truth, in every case, was a great deal more effortful than that. Let the clock settle now, the way it always eventually does in stories about timing. Somewhere in every one of these households, a widow sat with an unfinished manuscript and asked herself not only what the world should know, but when the world was ready to know it, and in answering that second question as carefully as the first, she shaped her husband's legacy just as thoroughly as any single sentence on any single page. Every pattern deserves its counterexample, and this one has an unusually sharp one. Not every woman writing about a Gilded Age industrialist was working to flatter him. Some were working, with equal patience and equal skill, to take him apart in print, and the most famous of these was not a wife at all, but a journalist named Ida Tarbell, whose meticulous multi-part history of the Standard Oil Company did more to damage John D. Rockefeller's reputation than any rival, any regulator, or any competitor ever managed to do through more conventional means. Tarbell's relationship to Rockefeller was, in its own way, just as intimate as any wife's relationship to a husband, though it took a completely different shape. She'd grown up in the Pennsylvania oil region, where her own father's small refining business had been squeezed out of existence by Standard Oil's aggressive tactics, and she carried that personal history into years of painstaking research, reading legal filings, interviewing former employees, tracking down internal company documents that Rockefeller's own lawyers had assumed no outsider would ever locate. The resulting history, published serially starting in 1902, did not rely on rumour or speculation. It relied on documentation so thorough that Rockefeller's own defenders struggled for decades to dispute its central claims. It is worth placing Tarbell directly alongside Louise Carnegie for a moment, because the contrast illuminates something essential about the whole practice this story has been describing. Both women spent years assembling an enormous quantity of material about a specific, enormously wealthy industrialist. Both women exercised extraordinary editorial judgment over what to include and what to leave out, understanding precisely how each choice would shape a reader's final impression. Both women understood, with real sophistication, exactly how narrative sequencing could make a reader feel a particular way about a man's character, without ever needing to state an opinion directly. The difference lay entirely in the intended effect. Louise Carnegie was building a legacy. Ida Tarbell was dismantling one. This matters because it corrects a temptation, easy to fall into across a long night of stories about devoted wives and careful widows, to imagine that women's historical labour in this era was uniformly protective, uniformly softening, uniformly aimed at flattering the powerful men in their orbit. Tarbell proves otherwise. She used exactly the same underlying skills, patient research, careful sequencing, an instinct for which detail lands hardest with a reader, toward the opposite end. Where Louise Carnegie chose which stories to keep in service of warmth, Tarbell chose which documents to publish in service of accountability. The tools were identical, the purposes could not have been more different. Rockefeller himself understood, better than almost anyone, exactly what Tarbell had accomplished, and his response reveals something important about how seriously these men took the power of a well-constructed narrative, even when that narrative came from a woman entirely outside their own household. He reportedly referred to her, in private, by an unflattering nickname, and Standard Oil's public relations apparatus, one of the first sophisticated corporate PR operations in American history, was assembled largely as a direct response to the damage her reporting had done. A company that had spent decades believing its enormous wealth made it functionally immune to public opinion discovered, through Tarbell's work, that a sufficiently patient and sufficiently well-documented piece of writing could reshape public perception in ways no amount of money could easily undo. There is a lesson here that applies just as much to the flattering memoirs as to Tarbell's unflattering history. The men at the centre of these stories rarely controlled their own historical reputation directly, whatever they may have believed while they were alive and still issuing instructions from a boardroom. That control passed, in nearly every case, to whichever woman happened to be closest to the material, a wife with access to private letters and private memory, or a journalist with the patience to track down public records no one else had bothered to examine. Wealth and power, it turns out, offered surprisingly little defence against a sufficiently determined and sufficiently skilled woman writer, regardless of which direction her sympathies eventually pointed. It is worth imagining, too, what it must have felt like to be Tarbell, working for years on material that made her deeply unpopular within certain circles of American business, at a time when women writing serious investigative journalism about major corporations were a genuine rarity, viewed with suspicion by editors and subjects alike. She persisted anyway, publishing installment after installment in McClure's magazine, building her case with the same unhurried, methodical patience that Louise Carnegie brought to her husband's memoir on the other side of this same historical moment. Both women were, in their own ways, denied easy credit for the full scope of their achievement during their own lifetimes. Louise remembered mainly as a devoted wife, Ida dismissed by her subject and his allies as a muckraker with a grudge, rather than the meticulous historian her work actually proves her to have been. History has been somewhat kinder to Tarbell than to most of the wives in this story, if only because her work survives under her own name, credited from the very first installment, rather than tucked away in an anonymous preface. But even her reputation required decades to fully settle into the respect it deserves. For much of the 20th century, she was remembered primarily as a critic of Rockefeller rather than as one of the founding figures of American investigative journalism, her scholarly rigour overshadowed by the simple fact that a woman had dared to take on one of the era's most powerful men in print and remarkably won. Consider what these two women, working toward opposite ends with the same essential toolkit, together reveal about the Gilded Age's actual relationship to historical memory. It was never simply a story of powerful men writing their own legends unopposed. It was a story with far more women exercising far more narrative control than the era's own self-image ever cared to admit, some of them working from inside a marriage to protect a beloved reputation, others working from entirely outside the household to hold that same class of men accountable for exactly the practices their wives were elsewhere, quietly working to soften. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the specific texture of Tarbell's research process, because it illuminates just how much patience this kind of work required, regardless of which side of the ledger a woman happened to be writing from. She spent years combing through court records from decades-old litigation, cross-referencing shipping rates and railroad rebates that Standard Oil had negotiated in near-total secrecy, building a picture so granular that even sympathetic critics of Rockefeller initially doubted anyone could sustain that level of detail across an entire serialized history. She travelled to interview former employees who had left the company on bad terms, weighing their testimony carefully against the documentary record rather than simply accepting the most damning version of events at face value. This was not the work of someone driven purely by anger at her father's ruined business. It was the work of someone determined to build a case so solid that even Rockefeller's own formidable legal team would struggle to locate a factual error worth publicly disputing. That discipline is precisely what made her history so much more damaging than a simple polemic could ever have been. A hostile opinion piece can be dismissed as bias. A meticulously documented history, built patiently from primary sources and cross-checked testimony, is much harder to wave away. And Standard Oil's own internal correspondence from the period shows a company genuinely rattled by exactly this quality in her work, not by her hostility, which they had anticipated and could easily discount, but by her accuracy, which they could not. Let this settle for a moment before the story moves toward its quieter hours. Two women, on opposite sides of the same industrial fortune, each spending years of careful, patient labour to decide how the public would understand a powerful man's life. One working from inside the marriage bed, one working from a rented office lined with subpoenaed documents, both proving, in their very different ways, that the real authorship of the Gilded Age belonged to whoever was patient enough to do the work nobody else wanted to do. If you're drifting now, let yourself go, subscribe so the next story's waiting when you return. Sleep well. Not every woman in this story chose the page as her instrument. Some chose something more permanent, or at least something that felt more permanent at the time. An institution, a building, an estate transformed into a purpose that would outlive both husband and wife by generations. Katrina Trask belongs to this category, and her story unfolds a little differently than the others, because the man whose legacy she shaped was not primarily remembered for scandal or excess, but for a kind of Gilded Age idealism that placed the two of them, husband and wife together, on the same side of the historical record from the very beginning. Katrina married Spencer Trask, a Wall Street financier, in the late 19th century, and the two of them built an estate near Saratoga Springs, New York, that they called Yaddo, a name the Trasks' own young daughter had apparently invented, one of the small domestic details that survived precisely because the family chose deliberately to preserve it. The marriage was marked by a grief so severe it is difficult to summarize without pausing over it. All four of the couple's children died in childhood, a sequence of losses that would have broken many marriages entirely, and that instead seems to have pushed Katrina and Spencer toward an unusual, almost fierce determination to make something permanent out of a life that had already taken so much from them. That determination eventually became the decision, made jointly by husband and wife while both were still alive, to transform Yaddo after their deaths into a retreat for working artists, a place where writers, composers, and painters could live and work without the ordinary financial pressures of daily life intruding on their creative concentration. This was not, on its surface, an act of historical revision in the way Louise Carnegie's editing or Consuelo Vanderbilt's Memoir were. It did not involve rewriting a difficult episode or softening an inconvenient truth, but it was, in its own quieter way, exactly the same kind of work this entire story has been describing, the deliberate construction of how two lives would be remembered, built not from paragraphs, but from an entire physical institution designed to outlast both of the people who created it. Consider what Katrina actually accomplished through this choice. A husband remembered only for his Wall Street career, however successful, tends to fade from public memory within a generation or two once the specific financial deals that made his reputation lose their relevance to a changing economy. A husband whose name is permanently attached to an institution that continues actively to shape American culture, an institution that has, in the decades since Yaddo's founding, hosted the writers and composers behind dozens of Pulitzer Prizes and National Book Awards, is remembered on an entirely different timescale. Spencer Trask is not primarily remembered today for his financial acumen. He is remembered because his wife understood that a legacy built from an ongoing living purpose would prove more durable than any legacy built from a single finished text. This insight deserves more credit than it typically receives in the broader story of Gilded Age philanthropy, which tends to focus on the men who wrote the checks rather than the women who often conceived of the purpose those checks would serve. Katrina Trask was not merely her husband's supportive companion in this endeavour. Surviving correspondence and her own writings suggest she was, if anything, the primary architect of the specific vision Yaddo eventually embodied, the belief that creative work required protection from financial anxiety, that artists flourished best when given uninterrupted time rather than simply money, a philosophy that shaped the institution's structure from its earliest planning long before either Trask had died. There is something worth noticing in how this form of legacy building differs from the memoir writing this story has spent so much time describing. A memoir can be contested, revised in later editions, undermined by a rival biographer working from different sources. An institution, once established and properly endowed, tends to develop its own institutional momentum, its own board of trustees invested in its continuation, its own beneficiaries, in Yaddo's case, generations of working artists, with every incentive to speak well of the founders who made their work possible. Katrina Trask did not simply write a favourable account of her husband's life. She built a mechanism that would keep generating favourable accounts indefinitely, long after any single memoir would have gone out of print and been forgotten. It is worth imagining Katrina in her final years, walking the grounds of the estate she and Spencer had built, already knowing what it would eventually become, already aware that the private grief of losing 4 children had been transformed, deliberately, into a purpose large enough to hold that grief without being consumed by it entirely. This is a different register of legacy management than the careful editing of a difficult manuscript, but it draws on exactly the same underlying skill this whole story keeps returning to, the ability to look clearly at a life, including its hardest and most painful chapters, and decide with real deliberation what shape that life's remaining record should take. Yaddo continues to operate today, more than a century after its founding, still hosting artists in the same buildings Katrina and Spencer once walked through together. Visitors who arrive for a residency there rarely spend much time considering the specific mechanics of how this institution came to exist, focused as they understandably are on their own creative work rather than on the marriage that made their residency possible. But the institution itself is, in its every operating detail, an artifact of one woman's careful, patient decision about how a shared grief and a shared fortune should ultimately be remembered, proof that the work this story has been describing did not always require a pen at all, and sometimes required instead an entire estate, patiently transformed into something that would keep telling its founder's story long after either of them could tell it themselves. It is worth considering too what Katrina herself wrote during her lifetime, because she was not silent on the page in the way this particular chapter's framing might suggest. She published poetry and plays of her own, some of it explicitly working through the grief of losing 4 children, and this writing offers a rare window into how she understood her own life before any institution existed to tell that story on her behalf. Reading her private work alongside the eventual public legacy of Yaddo, you can trace a clear line from personal sorrow to deliberate purpose, a woman who first wrote her way through unbearable loss, and only later, once the writing had done what writing could do, turned to bricks and endowments and legal trusts to build something the poetry alone could not sustain across generations. This progression matters because it complicates any tidy division between the women who wrote their husbands' stories and the women who built institutions instead. Katrina did both, in sequence, moving from the intimate register of personal poetry toward the much larger register of permanent philanthropic structure once she understood the limits of what any single text, however honest, could accomplish on its own. A poem can move a reader for an afternoon. An endowed institution can shape the working lives of artists for 100 years and counting. She seems to have arrived at that understanding gradually, through the accumulated experience of watching her own earlier writing succeed at expressing grief but fail, on its own, to transform that grief into anything lasting beyond the page. There is a lesson in this progression that applies quietly to every other woman in tonight's story, even those who never built an institution of their own. The choice between a memoir and a monument, between a carefully edited manuscript and a carefully endowed foundation, was never really a choice between two entirely separate strategies. It was a choice about scale and permanence, made by women who understood, each in her own way, that the raw material of memory, a husband's life, a shared grief, a fortune built across decades, required some deliberate structure to survive the passage of time intact. Some chose paper, some chose stone and legal trusts. Katrina Trask, unusually, chose both, in careful sequence, and left behind a legacy that still, more than a century later, continues to do exactly the work she designed it to do. Let this settle into the night's steady rhythm now. A house near Saratoga Springs, its rooms once filled with a grieving couple's private sorrow, now filled instead with working writers who owe their quiet, uninterrupted hours to a woman who understood, long before she ever needed to prove it, that some legacies are built not from what gets written down, but from what gets kept alive. There is a particular kind of writing that deserves closer attention than it usually receives, tucked as it always is at the very front of these books, easy for an eager reader to skim past on the way to the story itself. The preface. It is worth slowing down here, in this quiet stretch of the night, to consider what a preface actually does, and why so many of the women in this story chose it as their primary, sometimes only, visible presence in a book otherwise dominated entirely by a husband's voice. A preface occupies a strange, useful position in the architecture of a book. It is not quite part of the main narrative, and so it is held to a different standard of scrutiny. Readers expect a preface to be personal, brief, a little sentimental, the author's own voice offered as a kind of frame before the real story begins. This makes it the perfect vehicle for exactly the kind of quiet self-positioning these widows needed to accomplish. In a few hundred words, a preface could establish a widow's credibility as steward of the manuscript, explain away any unevenness a careful reader might notice in the prose that followed, and preemptively answer questions about authenticity, all without ever making a single claim that could later be checked against contrary evidence. Look closely at Louise Carnegie's preface to her husband's autobiography, and you find exactly this kind of careful construction at work. She describes her husband's process of dictation and revision in loving, specific detail, establishing herself firmly as an eyewitness to the manuscript's creation. She explains the interruption of the war, the decline of his health, the reasons the book remains, in places, unfinished, and she credits the editor, Van Dyke, generously and specifically, in a way that quietly reassures readers the manuscript passed through professional hands, even as it also subtly establishes that her own hands had touched it first and most intimately. None of this reads, on a first pass, as anything other than a devoted widow's simple, heartfelt introduction. That is precisely the point. The preface's entire rhetorical power depends on its appearing artless, spontaneous, unconsidered, the natural overflow of a grieving wife's affection rather than a carefully constructed piece of persuasive writing. And yet examine the specific choices being made, sentence by sentence, and you find exactly the same editorial discipline these women brought to the manuscripts themselves, which details to include, which to omit, how much personal grief to display and how much to withhold, how to establish authority without ever explicitly claiming it. This skill, writing something that reads as artless while actually being carefully composed, deserves recognition as its own distinct literary achievement, separate from and in some ways more difficult than the more visible work of shaping a full manuscript. A preface has almost no room for error. Every sentence must do multiple kinds of work simultaneously. Establish tone, establish credibility, explain gaps, deflect potential criticism, and above all, never once betray the amount of deliberate calculation involved in accomplishing all of this within a few brief, seemingly casual paragraphs. The women who wrote these prefaces were, in effect, writing the instructions for how their own invisible labour throughout the rest of the book should be understood, all while making that instruction feel like nothing more than a natural expression of love. Elizabeth Drexel. Lehr's approach to this same challenge takes a slightly different shape, appropriate to the different kind of book she had written. Where Louise Carnegie's preface establishes her as a careful custodian of an already existing manuscript, Elizabeth's own framing throughout King Lear and the Gilded Age must accomplish something more delicate still, establishing herself as a reliable narrator of decades of high society gossip, while simultaneously, silently, managing the reader's expectations around a marriage she could never fully explain. Her framing works by tone rather than direct statement, an accumulated impression of wry, affectionate, occasionally rueful familiarity with her subject that never once tips over into the kind of specific accusation that might force the book to address what it could not name. Consider, too, how these prefaces functioned for the publishers who reviewed them before release. A well-crafted preface reassured an editor nervous about a book's reception, offering exactly the kind of authenticating frame a marketing department could quote in advertisements. The loving widow, faithfully preserving her husband's final words for a grateful public. Publishers understood the commercial value of this framing as clearly as the widows themselves did, which is one reason these prefaces so rarely required extensive editorial revision before publication. Both parties had, without necessarily discussing it explicitly, arrived at the same understanding of what the preface needed to accomplish, and the finished product reflects that quiet alignment of interests. It is worth noting finally how differently these prefaces read once you know what to look for, once the entire pattern this story has been tracing across several hours becomes visible. A first-time reader encountering Louise Carnegie's preface, without any of this context, experiences exactly what she intended. A warm, simple introduction from a devoted widow. A reader who has spent time considering the broader pattern of women's invisible authorship across this entire era experiences something closer to a coded document, a careful negotiation of credit and modesty conducted in full public view, hidden in plain sight behind a tone so gentle that almost no one, at the time, thought to read it any other way. It is worth remembering, too, that not every widow chose to write a preface at all, and that choice itself carries meaning. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balson's memoir opens with no elaborate framing device, no careful positioning of herself as devoted custodian of someone else's words, because the book she had written required no such framing. She was not preserving her husband's voice, she was replacing the public record with her own, and a memoir written entirely in one's own name, about one's own life, has no need for the delicate authenticating apparatus a ghost-written or heavily edited memoir requires. The absence of an elaborate preface in her case is, in its own way, as telling as the presence of one in Louise Carnegie's, a signal before the reader has even reached the first chapter of exactly whose voice they are about to encounter, unmediated by any need for justification. This distinction between the framed memoir and the unframed one offers a useful way of sorting the entire body of work this story has been describing. Books that required extensive prefatory justification were, almost without exception, books in which a woman's editorial hand had shaped material that carried a man's name on the cover, the preface existing precisely to explain and legitimize that gap between authorship and attribution. Books written entirely in a woman's own voice, about her own experience, required no such apparatus because there was no gap to explain. The presence or absence of an elaborate preface functions, in retrospect, almost like a fingerprint, telling careful readers a great deal about the true nature of a book's composition before a single chapter of the actual narrative has even begun. There is a final observation worth making about these prefaces before the story moves on, one that concerns not their content but their eventual fate in the historical record. Prefaces, precisely because they were treated as minor framing material rather than substantive content, were rarely quoted, rarely anthologized, rarely studied with the same rigor scholars eventually brought to the memoir's main text. This means that the clearest, most direct evidence of these widows' own self-understanding of their work, the place where they came closest to describing, in their own words, exactly what they believed themselves to be doing, has received, across a century of scholarship, considerably less attention than the material it was designed to introduce. The instructions for how to read these women's invisible labour have been sitting in plain sight the entire time, in a section of the book most readers still, out of long habit, skip entirely on their way to the story itself. Let this settle for a while before the story continues. A few hundred words tucked at the very front of a book, easy to skim past on the way to more exciting material, and inside those few hundred words, if you read closely enough, an entire argument about who really deserves credit for everything that follows, made so quietly that most readers never once notice the argument is being made at all. Step back now from the desks and the manuscripts for a moment, and consider the household itself, the physical space in which all of this quiet editorial labour actually took place, and the people who moved through that space every day without ever once appearing in any of the finished books. A Gilded Age mansion of the size these families occupied required an enormous staff to function at all. Housekeepers, cooks, ladies' maids, valets, footmen, gardeners, coachmen, and later chauffeurs, a hierarchy of labour so extensive that a house like the Fifth Avenue mansions of this era might employ 20 or 30 people simply to keep its daily rhythms running smoothly, invisible to the family they served except at the precise moments their service was required. These servants saw everything. They saw a widow rise before dawn to sit at her husband's desk, working through his papers by lamplight before the rest of the household had stirred. They saw the visits from lawyers and publishers' representatives, arriving quietly through a side entrance rather than the formal front door, meetings conducted with the discretion that suggested, even to staff untrained in the finer points of publishing negotiation, that something requiring careful handling was underway. They saw the fireplaces burn late into the night in rooms where no one had ordered a fire for warmth. They understood, in the particular way that household staff of this era understood so much about their employers' private lives without ever being permitted to acknowledge that understanding openly, exactly what kind of work was happening behind those closed study doors. And yet almost none of this observational knowledge survives in any form we can now consult directly. Household staff of the Gilded Age left behind remarkably little written record of their own, for reasons that had everything to do with the era's rigid social structure and almost nothing to do with any lack of insight on their part. Many domestic workers of this period had limited formal education. Fewer still would have imagined that their daily observations of a wealthy household's private rhythms constituted material worth preserving for posterity, and fewer still again would have felt safe committing such observations to paper, even if the thought had occurred to them, given how easily a servant's indiscretion about an employer's private business could end in dismissal without reference, a genuinely catastrophic outcome in an era with no meaningful safety net for domestic workers between positions. This silence matters enormously to how we understand the story this whole night has been tracing. We know about Louise Carnegie's editorial process largely because Louise herself chose, through her preface, and through what correspondence survives, to describe it in terms flattering to her own devotion. We know comparatively little about how that process actually looked from the perspective of the people who lived alongside it daily, whether the household staff understood it as a beautiful act of marital devotion, as a shrewd financial negotiation, as something closer to obligation than love, or as some complicated blend of all three that no single word could adequately capture. Their perspective, arguably the most objective vantage point available on these events at the time they were actually happening, has simply not survived in any form historians can now access with confidence. There are occasional exceptions, fragments that hint at what a fuller record might have revealed. A handful of memoirs written by former domestic staff did eventually appear, mostly decades later, once the social taboos around servants discussing their former employers had loosened somewhat, and mostly focused on households less prominent than the ones this story is centered on, families whose reputations carried less legal and social risk to discuss candidly. These surviving accounts tend to describe wealthy households with a mixture of genuine affection and clear-eyed acknowledgement of the enormous gulf separating a servant's daily reality from an employer's, offering brief, tantalizing glimpses of exactly the kind of domestic texture that would illuminate so much about how these widows' late-night editorial sessions actually felt to the people living alongside them, before falling silent again on the specific details that might have identified a particular family too precisely for comfortable publication. It is worth imagining, in the absence of a fuller record, what a housekeeper or a lady's maid might have made of watching a grieving widow work through her husband's papers night after night. There would have been practical observations, certainly, which lamps needed refilling later than usual, which meals were sent up to a study rather than eaten in the formal dining room, how much later than usual a household's most senior members retired to bed during the weeks a particular chapter was being revised. But there would likely also have been a more intuitive, harder to articulate understanding of what this labour actually meant, an understanding built from years of proximity to a specific marriage's particular rhythms, the kind of intimate knowledge that comes only from having dressed someone every morning for a decade, or having served a couple's meals together for so many years that their private conversation had become, whether anyone intended it or not, simply part of the ambient texture of a servant's working day. This lost perspective deserves acknowledgement even though it cannot be recovered, because it is a reminder that the story this night has been telling, however carefully researched, remains fundamentally a story told from the vantage point of those who left written records, which is to say, overwhelmingly, a story told from the vantage point of the wealthy themselves. The household staff who witnessed these late-night editorial sessions most directly, who might have offered the clearest and most unsentimental account of what was actually happening in these studies and drawing rooms, remain almost entirely silent in the historical record, their observations lost not through any deliberate act of destruction, like the burned letters described earlier, but simply through the ordinary, unremarked erasure that befalls the testimony of people whose social position never afforded them the assumption that their own perspective mattered enough to preserve. There is something worth sitting with in that erasure, in this particular quiet hour of the night, even as the larger story continues to focus, of necessity, on the women whose voices did survive. Every act of historical preservation is also, unavoidably, an act of historical omission, and the omissions in this story are not evenly distributed. We can trace in remarkable detail how a wealthy widow chose to shape her husband's memory. We can trace almost nothing about how the people who served that same household, who witnessed the process most intimately of anyone alive, understood what they were watching unfold in front of them, night after night, in rooms they entered only to deliver a meal or tend a fire before withdrawing again into the household's vast and largely undocumented lower floors. Let this settle into the night's quieter register now. Somewhere below every study where a widow worked through her husband's papers by lamplight, an entire household of servants moved through their own parallel version of that same story, watching, understanding, and ultimately saying nothing that would survive long enough for anyone tonight to hear it. Not every private document met the fireplace. Some survived, deliberately preserved, and these surviving letters offer a different kind of window into this whole story than the finished memoirs do, rawer, less polished, written in the moment rather than reconstructed decades later with the smoothing benefit of hindsight. Correspondence between spouses in the Gilded Age tends to read, to modern eyes, with a formality that can seem to hold real feeling at arm's length, but read patiently enough, across years of accumulated letters, and a marriage's actual emotional weather begins to emerge from beneath the careful phrasing. Louise Carnegie's surviving letters to her husband, written during their occasional separations when business or family obligations kept them apart, reveal a woman who managed practical household matters with the same competence she would later bring to his unfinished manuscript, while also expressing, in language restrained by the conventions of the era, but unmistakable in its warmth, a genuine and sustained affection across more than 3 decades of marriage. These letters were not written for publication. They were written for an audience of one, and they carry a candour the eventual autobiography, shaped as it was for public consumption, simply could not afford to include. This raises an interesting question about which record we should actually trust more, and the honest answer is neither one fully, but each for different purposes. The private letters tell us more about the texture of daily affection and daily irritation, the small negotiations of a long marriage, the practical concerns that filled most ordinary days far more than any grand historical drama ever did. The published memoir tells us more about how that marriage wanted to be remembered, the version its participants believed the world deserved to see. Both are true, neither is complete. and the gap between them is precisely where most of the interesting work of this whole story has been happening. Consider, too, what it meant for a widow to possess this kind of intimate correspondence, while simultaneously constructing a more public account of the same marriage. She was, in effect, working from two different sources at once: the polished stories her husband had told at dinner tables for decades, and the far more private record of their own written exchanges, which likely contained disagreements, worries, ordinary tedium, and moments of genuine tenderness that never made it into any dinner table story at all. Deciding how much of that private record to let inform the public one, and how much to keep entirely separate, required a judgment call that the finished memoirs give us almost no direct evidence of, precisely because that judgment call happened invisibly, in the private space between one drawer of letters and one manuscript destined for a publisher's desk. Some families eventually donated these private letters to archives and universities, decades after the principal figures involved had died, and it is through these donations that historians today can occasionally glimpse the gap between the public and private versions of these marriages. The letters rarely contradict the memoirs outright. More often, they simply reveal a fuller, more textured version of events the memoirs had compressed into a cleaner, more flattering shape. A business worry that consumed weeks of private correspondence might occupy a single sentence in the eventual autobiography. A minor disagreement about a household matter, clearly significant enough at the time to generate several exchanged letters, might not appear at all in the finished public account. This pattern of compression, rather than outright falsification, characterizes most of the gap between private correspondence and public memoir across this entire story. These widows were rarely inventing events that never happened. They were, far more often, simply deciding which true events deserved to survive into the smaller, more curated space a published book allows, and which true events, however real, belonged more properly to the private record a marriage generates simply by existing day after day, year after year, without anyone involved imagining every letter would eventually be read by strangers. It is worth imagining finally what it must have felt like to read back through decades of one's own correspondence while assembling a husband's memoir, encountering on aging paper one's own younger handwriting, one's own younger worries and hopes, preserved exactly as they had been written years or decades earlier, unfiltered by the intervening years of hindsight that had since reshaped how the writer understood her own life. This kind of reading is disorienting even under ordinary circumstances. Undertaken in the specific context of assembling a husband's public legacy, it must have required an unusual kind of emotional discipline, the ability to feel, fully, whatever those old letters stirred up, and then to set that feeling carefully aside long enough to make a clear-eyed editorial decision about what the finished book actually needed. Let this settle now, the way old paper settles into an archive box decades after anyone still living remembers exactly what it contains. Somewhere in these surviving letters, still readable today by anyone with the patience to request the right archival folder, an entire private version of these marriages continues to exist quietly alongside the more famous public one, waiting, unread by most, for anyone curious enough to notice the gap between the two. There is also the matter of what these letters reveal about the practical texture of managing a Gilded Age household across long separations, since business travel and seasonal migrations between city and country properties kept many wealthy couples apart for weeks or months at a stretch throughout any given year. Louise's letters to Andrew during these periods read less like romantic correspondence in the modern sense, and more like detailed status reports from a capable partner managing an enormous operation in her husband's absence. Updates on library dedication ceremonies, notes on which political figures had requested meetings, careful accounts of household expenses and staff matters requiring his eventual approval. Even in these ostensibly private, unpolished documents, her instinct for clear, well-organized communication is unmistakable. The same instinct that would later serve her so well in the far more consequential work of assembling his unfinished memoir. It is worth noting, too, how these letters occasionally capture moments of genuine uncertainty that never survived into any later, more polished account. A letter written during a period of business difficulty might reveal Louise's private worry about the family's finances in a way the eventual autobiography, written from the comfortable distance of established permanent wealth, never needed to acknowledge. These moments of uncertainty humanize the marriage in ways the finished public record, by its very nature as a celebration of eventual success, could not afford to preserve. Success stories rarely dwell on the years when success still felt uncertain, even when those years constituted some of the most vivid, most keenly felt periods of the actual lived marriage. It is worth pausing now, deep in the unhurried middle hours of this story, to place Louise Carnegie and Elizabeth Drexel Lehr directly side by side, because the contrast between them illustrates just how differently this same basic task, a widow deciding what history would know about her marriage, could be performed, depending on the specific truth each woman was managing. Louise's task was, in its essentials, the simpler of the two, though simpler should not be mistaken for easy. She was preserving and completing an account her husband had substantially begun himself, working from his own dictated memories, his own chosen anecdotes, his own sense of which parts of his rise from poverty to fortune deserved emphasis. Her editorial work was real and consequential, but it operated within a frame Andrew Carnegie himself had already largely established. She was not inventing a version of him from nothing. She was finishing a portrait he had already begun to sketch. Elizabeth's task was considerably more complex, because she was working without any comparable foundation from Harry Lehr himself. He left behind no substantial memoir of his own for her to complete. She was constructing an entire account from her own memory alone, decades after the fact, while simultaneously managing a secret her husband had never acknowledged even to her directly, at least not in any form that survives in writing. Where Louise's editorial choices involved selecting among her husband's own stories, Elizabeth's editorial choices involved constructing an entire narrative architecture capable of holding a truth too dangerous to state, using only her own patient control of tone and implication to do the work a more direct account never could. This difference in difficulty produced, unsurprisingly, two very different kinds of finished books. Carnegie's autobiography reads with a warmth and confidence that suggests a subject entirely at peace with his own story, because in large part he was, his own voice, however shaped by his wife's editorial hand, remains the dominant presence throughout. King Lear and the Gilded Age reads with a more complicated undertone, a wit and warmth on the surface that never quite settles into simple comfort, because underneath that surface Elizabeth was managing a tension her book could never fully resolve without breaking the careful frame she had built to contain it. And yet both books succeeded in their own ways at exactly what their authors needed them to accomplish. Both preserved a husband's public reputation. Both provided their authors with a measure of financial security during widowhood. Both, perhaps most importantly, gave these women a sense of completed obligation, a feeling, however privately held, that they had done right by a marriage that had asked a great deal of them, and given in return its own complicated mixture of genuine devotion and real limitation. It is worth asking, too, whether either woman ever felt fully at peace with the specific choices her book required. Louise Carnegie's surviving correspondence offers little evidence of second thoughts about her editorial choices, suggesting a woman who found genuine satisfaction in the finished work. Elizabeth Drexel Lehr's later writings and interviews are harder to read with confidence on this question, offering glimpses of a woman who seemed, even in old age, to be still working through the complicated legacy of her first marriage, still turning the same questions over decades after the book that was supposed to resolve them had already been published and received. There is no tidy lesson to draw from placing these two women side by side, beyond the simple observation that the same basic task, writing a husband's story, managing his legacy, deciding what the world deserved to know, could demand wildly different resources, wildly different emotional labour, and wildly different degrees of success, depending entirely on the specific truth each woman was working with. Some marriages left behind a clean, if incomplete, foundation to build from. Others left behind almost nothing solid at all, requiring their widows to construct an entire narrative architecture from memory, instinct, and careful restraint, with no husband's own dictated pages to lean on when the work grew difficult. Let both women rest now in this comparison, side by side but never quite identical, two versions of the same essential task performed under two very different sets of circumstances. Somewhere between Louise Carnegie's confident, warmly received autobiography and Elizabeth Drexel Lehr's carefully guarded, quietly haunted memoir lies the full range of what this particular kind of widowhood actually required. Not one single story, but as many different stories as there were marriages complicated enough to need this kind of careful, patient, largely uncredited repair. It is worth considering a third figure alongside these two, if only briefly, to sharpen the comparison further. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Balson's task differed from both Louise's and Elizabeth's in a crucial respect. She was not managing anyone else's legacy at all, but reclaiming her own life from a narrative other people, her mother, the press, the entire apparatus of Gilded Age society reporting, had constructed about her without her consent. Where Louise completed a husband's story and Elizabeth constructed one almost from scratch around a careful silence, Consuelo's task was closer to demolition and rebuilding at once, tearing down a fairy tale that had stood unchallenged for 50 years and replacing it with an account far closer to what she had actually lived. 3 women, 3 marriages, 3 entirely different relationships to the truth each one needed her book to hold. What unites all 3, despite these differences, is the sheer patience each woman's task required. None of these books emerged quickly or easily, or without sustained emotional labour extending across months and often years of careful, private work. Whether completing a husband's own dictated pages, constructing an entirely new narrative around an unspoken secret, or correcting a public fairy tale that had calcified over half a century, each woman had to sit repeatedly with material that was genuinely difficult to hold, and had to keep returning to that material, revision after revision, until it finally took a shape she could live with publishing under her own name, or under the name of the husband she had chosen, in each case to protect. What control could never fully reach. For all the patience and skill these women brought to the task of shaping how their husbands would be remembered, it is worth acknowledging gently that none of them achieved anything like complete control. History has a way of leaking around even the most carefully constructed narrative through channels no single widow could ever fully anticipate or close off entirely. Newspaper archives preserved contemporary coverage that a later memoir could soften but never erase. Court records from lawsuits and labour disputes remained on file long after any private correspondence describing the same events had been quietly burned. Rival families, with their own competing versions of shared history, kept their own records, shaped by their own interests, which did not always align conveniently with whatever version a particular widow hoped would become the accepted account. Andrew Carnegie's Homestead strike offers a clear example of this leakage. However gently Louise Carnegie's edited autobiography chose to frame that difficult episode, the underlying historical record, newspaper coverage from 1892, the testimony of surviving workers and their families, the photographs of armed guards facing down striking steelworkers, remained available to any historian willing to look past the memoir's softer, more retrospective tone. The autobiography shaped how casual readers, encountering Carnegie's story for the first time through his own supposed words, would likely understand the episode. It could not erase the fuller record available to anyone who went looking for it, and generations of labour historians have done exactly that, producing an account of Homestead considerably less forgiving than the one Louise's careful editing had hoped might become the primary lens through which her husband's legacy was understood. This limitation deserves real acknowledgement, because it corrects any temptation to imagine these widows as possessing some near-total power over historical memory. They possessed real influence, exercised with real skill, over a specific and important category of record, the authorized, personal, first-person account that a great many readers would encounter as a subject's own definitive word on his own life. But that influence operated alongside, not instead of, an enormous parallel record generated by newspapers, courts, business rivals, government investigators, and eventually professional historians, none of whom answered to any widow's editorial judgment, and many of whom had their own competing interests in how a particular story should be told. Elizabeth Drexel, Lehr's careful management of her husband's secret offers a similar lesson from a different angle. However skillfully her memoir circled the truth of Harry Lehr's private life without ever stating it directly, that truth did not remain permanently hidden. Social historians working decades later, drawing on a wider range of sources than any single widow could control, private letters from other members of their social circle, medical and legal records that occasionally surfaced through unrelated research, the simple accumulated weight of pattern recognition, once society's own understanding of sexuality had evolved enough to make earlier evasions legible for what they actually were, eventually reconstructed a fuller picture than Elizabeth's own careful book had ever explicitly provided. Her control over the narrative was real and consequential in her own lifetime. It was never permanent, because no individual's control over historical memory ever fully is. There is something almost reassuring in this limitation if you sit with it long enough in the quiet of this hour. The work these women did was not, in the end, an act of total deception capable of permanently overwriting historical truth. It was something more modest and more human, an attempt, using the tools actually available to them, to shape the immediate reception of a life at the specific moment that reception mattered most to the people still living through its aftermath. They could not control what historians a century later would eventually piece together from a wider, richer body of evidence than any single widow ever had access to herself. They could only control the version that reached readers in their own lifetime, and perhaps for a generation or two beyond it, before the slower, more patient work of historical scholarship eventually caught up with whatever these careful books had chosen to leave out. This is, in its way, a fair description of what any act of memory-keeping can actually accomplish, whether performed by a Gilded Age widow or by anyone else attempting to preserve or shape how a life will be understood after it ends. Memory is never a permanent seal. It is a temporary arrangement, effective for as long as the people who care most about a particular version remain alive and engaged enough to maintain it, gradually loosening its grip as new evidence surfaces, new generations arrive with different questions, new archives open that earlier custodians never anticipated would eventually become accessible to strangers with no personal stake in the outcome. Consider, too, what this limitation meant for the widows themselves in the years after publication, watching their carefully constructed accounts take their place in a wider cultural conversation they could no longer fully steer. Louise Carnegie lived until 1946, more than a quarter century after her husband's autobiography first appeared, long enough to watch new biographies of Andrew Carnegie begin to appear from authors working with considerably more critical distance than her own loving preface had ever allowed. She could not stop these newer accounts from complicating the picture her own careful editing had constructed. She could only, presumably, watch, with whatever mixture of resignation and continued conviction any person feels when a story they worked hard to protect begins, slowly, to be told in ways they no longer control. Let this settle now as a kind of honest counterweight to everything the story has described so far. These women accomplished something real and skillful, shaping how their husbands would be remembered in ways that mattered enormously in their own time, and that still shape popular understanding today. But the fuller truth, in every single case this story has traced, eventually found its way into the historical record regardless, not despite these women's careful work, but simply because history, given enough time and enough patient scholarship, tends to accumulate more evidence than any single custodian, however devoted, can ever fully contain. It is worth adding one further example to make this pattern of eventual leakage fully concrete. Jay Gould, one of the most reviled financiers of the entire era, left behind no carefully managed widow's memoir at all, no Louise Carnegie, no Elizabeth Drexel Lehr, working patiently to soften his reputation for posterity. His own family seems to have made a different calculation entirely, choosing distance and quiet rather than active narrative management, perhaps concluding, reasonably enough given the scale of public hostility he had accumulated during his lifetime, that no amount of careful editing could meaningfully rehabilitate a reputation already so thoroughly settled in the public mind. His story survives today largely through the accounts of biographers with no personal stake in flattering him, and the resulting historical record, unmediated by any loving widow's careful hand, reads considerably harsher than most of the other figures this story has traced. The contrast is instructive. Where a widow chose to do the patient work of narrative management, a somewhat softer, more sympathetic record tends to survive. Where no one performed that work, or where the underlying reputation proved too damaged for any editing to meaningfully repair, history simply recorded what it recorded, largely unfiltered by anyone's careful hand. Every story this night has told shares a common shape, even across all their differences of circumstance and method. A man built something enormous during his lifetime, a fortune, a reputation, a social position that took decades of careful manoeuvring to establish. And a woman nearby, closer to him than anyone else alive, took on the quiet, patient, largely uncredited work of deciding what would survive of all that once he was gone or once he'd grown too old and tired to manage the telling himself. It is worth asking now what actually made the difference between the versions that survived and the versions that quietly faded. It was rarely raw talent alone, though every woman in this story possessed real skill with language and narrative. It was, more consistently, patience, the willingness to sit with difficult material for months or years rather than rushing toward a convenient resolution, the discipline to revise a single troublesome passage a dozen times until it finally struck the right balance between honesty and kindness, the capacity to hold grief and calculation in the same hand without letting either one overwhelm the careful work the other required. It was also, in nearly every case, a kind of invisibility that these women seemed to have accepted, whether willingly or simply because no other option was ever seriously available to them. None of them insisted on co-authorship credit in the way a modern collaborator almost certainly would. None of them seemed to have fought, at least not in any surviving record, for their names to appear more prominently than a modest preface allowed. This acceptance can read, from a modern vantage point, as a kind of unfairness worth noting plainly rather than romanticising away. These women did real, skilled, consequential work, and the world that received the finished result rarely knew, and rarely asked, whose hand had actually shaped it. And yet there is something else worth noticing in that same acceptance, something that complicates any simple reading of these women as merely exploited or overlooked. Several of them describe their own work, in the fragments of private writing that survive, not as a grievance but as a form of devotion they had chosen freely and found genuinely meaningful. Louise Carnegie's preface radiates a satisfaction that reads, even now, as entirely sincere. Katrina Trask's writing about Yaddo carries the unmistakable tone of a woman who found real purpose, not merely obligation, in the legacy she and her husband built together. This complexity deserves to remain complex rather than being flattened into either a simple story of exploitation or a simple story of romantic devotion. Both threads run through nearly every account this night has traced, woven together so tightly that separating them cleanly may not even be possible, or fair to the women who live the actual complicated reality. Consider, too, what these stories collectively suggest about the nature of historical memory itself, beyond the specific individuals involved. We tend to imagine history as something that simply happens and then gets recorded, a straightforward transcription of events onto the permanent page. These stories suggest something messier and more interesting. History gets built, deliberately, by people making countless small decisions about what to include and what to leave out, what to soften and what to sharpen, when to publish and when to wait. Most of history's readers never see this construction happening. They encounter only the finished, smooth result, and reasonably enough mistake that smoothness for simple, unmediated truth. The Gilded Age, more than most historical eras, invites this kind of scrutiny, because it left behind such an unusually rich paper trail. Memoirs, letters, newspaper archives, court records, all generated by a class of people wealthy enough to document their own lives extensively, and important enough that others documented those lives as well. This abundance of surviving material makes it possible, a century later, to actually trace the gap between the public and private record in a way that earlier or less thoroughly documented eras simply do not allow. We can see, with unusual clarity, exactly how these widows' quiet editorial work shaped the versions of these lives that eventually reached print, because so much of the surrounding evidence, the letters that weren't burned, the newspaper coverage that couldn't be recalled, the court records that remained on file regardless of anyone's personal preference, survived alongside the more curated public accounts. This is, in the end, perhaps the most valuable thing this whole story has to offer, beyond the simple pleasure of the individual anecdotes themselves. It offers a way of reading any historical account a little more carefully, not with suspicion exactly, but with a gentler kind of awareness that every finished narrative, however confident and complete it appears on the page, likely passed through hands and judgments that never once appear in its own text. Somewhere behind nearly every story worth telling, someone made careful, patient, largely invisible decisions about what that story would ultimately become. There is a final thread worth pulling before this chapter closes, one that connects back to where the night began. Andrew Carnegie spent the final years of his active life preaching that fortunes should not simply pass down through inheritance, unchanged and unexamined, from one generation to the next, He believed, or claimed to believe, that wealth carried an obligation to be actively, thoughtfully redirected rather than passively received. It is a strange, quiet irony that his own final legacy, the story of his own life, the version that would carry his name into the future, required exactly this kind of active, thoughtful redirection, performed not by Carnegie himself, but by the wife who understood, perhaps better than he ever fully articulated even to himself, that a life story is never simply inherited by history unchanged. It has to be built deliberately by someone patient enough to do the work. Let this settle now, slowly, the way every idea in this story has settled across the long hours since the lamp first appeared burning low in that Scottish castle. The versions that survived did not survive by accident. They survived because someone, usually a woman, usually working alone, usually without any expectation of credit, decided they deserved to survive and did the patient work required to make sure they did. Somewhere tonight, in climate-controlled rooms in university libraries and historical societies scattered across the eastern seaboard, the actual physical objects this story has been describing still exist. Boxes of Louise Carnegie's correspondence, the surviving drafts and editorial notes connected to King Lehr and the Gilded Age, whatever fragments of Katrina Trask's early writing predate the founding of Yaddo. These are not abstractions. They are folders and boxes, catalogued with reference numbers, waiting quietly on climate-controlled shelves for the occasional researcher who requests them, handles them with white cotton gloves, and returns them, afterward, to exactly the same quiet dark they came from. There is something worth sitting with in that image, in the final unhurried stretch of this story before sleep finally arrives. All the careful editing, all the patient revision, all the years of quiet labour this night has described, eventually settled into paper, and that paper eventually settled into boxes, and those boxes now simply wait, mostly undisturbed, in rooms most of us will never visit. The women who did this work are gone. The husbands whose reputations they shaped are gone. Even the readers who first received these books with such warmth or such scandal are gone now too. Their reactions preserved only second-hand, in the reviews and letters that happened to survive alongside everything else. What remains, in the end, is simply the work itself. The careful sentences, the deliberate omissions, the patient architecture of memory these women built, sentence by sentence across so many quiet evenings. It survives not because anyone demanded it survive, but because paper, stored carefully enough, tends to outlast almost everything else about a life. Longer than reputation, longer than the social world that once made that reputation matter so intensely, longer even than the specific grief or devotion that motivated the writing in the first place. Let yourself imagine, one final time tonight, the desk in that Scottish castle where this whole story began. The lamp has long since burned out. The pages have been sorted, sent, published, reviewed, forgotten and rediscovered, decades later, by researchers who never knew the woman who first arranged them. The house itself still stands, though its rooms serve different purposes now than they did when Louise Carnegie sat working through the quiet hours of so many long summer nights. This is perhaps the gentlest way to close a story about legacy and memory, not with a grand conclusion, but with the simple, settled fact that the careful work continues to exist, quietly, waiting patiently in its boxes, needing nothing further from anyone. It has already done what it was built to do. It shaped, for a time, how the world understood a handful of remarkable, complicated lives. And now, its work largely finished, it simply rests, the way you are about to rest, the way every long night of careful attention eventually gives way to something softer and slower and at last, entirely still. The lamp is out now, the desk is empty. Somewhere far off, if you listen for it, there is only the soft, steady hush of a house settling into night, old wood easing, a window latch ticking faintly as the temperature drops. Nothing urgent, nothing that needs your attention any longer. You do not need to remember the names. Let them go gently, the way the widow finally set down her pen once the last page was finished. Let the dates go too, and the dollar amounts, and the particular arrangement of any single sentence you heard tonight. None of it needs to stay with you now. It has already done its work, the way a story always does, simply by being told once, patiently, into the quiet. What can stay, if anything stays at all, is only the feeling of it. Lamplight over old paper, a house settling into its own long silence, a life being carefully, lovingly folded into its final shape by someone who loved it enough to stay awake a little longer than she needed to. Let that feeling settle over you now the way it settled over her. The room around you is quiet. The night outside is quiet. There is nothing left to finish, nothing left to arrange, nothing left to decide. Whatever needs remembering has already been remembered. Whatever needs resting can rest now, completely, without asking your permission first. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders soften into whatever is holding you. Let the last of tonight's story drift away like lamplight fading from an old window, dimmer and dimmer, and then gone. Sleep well. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.